The telephone rang with a sharp, brittle insistency that sliced through the low murmur of the television set. A sound Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. had come to dread far more than the heavy silence of an empty house. He sat slumped in the armchair, the fabric worn at the elbows by years of shifting his weary weight, while a file concerning petty thefts in Hornsey rested open on his knees like a dead bird waiting for burial. The room held the thick, cloying scent of stale tobacco smoke mingled with the damp wool of a coat hung far too close to the hissing radiator, a domestic stagnation that suddenly felt fragile against the intrusive shrill of the night. "Jail." "Sir, it is Constable Hallett calling from Muswell Hill." The voice on the other end of the line was tight, stripped entirely of the casual deference usually found in late-night calls regarding drunk and disorderly patrons or domestic squabbles over burnt toast. "We have a situation at 23 Melrose Avenue where the landlord summoned a plumber, yet the man has refused to return to the property." Jay rubbed a rough hand over his face, feeling the gritty residue of the long day still embedded deep within his pores. "A plumber, Hallett, if you are waking me for a blocked toilet, I shall have your badge for breakfast." "It is not a toilet, sir, but the main drain itself." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken horror, before the constable continued. The man stated the blockage felt soft to the rod. He said it gave way beneath the pressure like meat. The line crackled with a burst of static that sounded uncomfortably similar to a human gasp, causing Jay to close the file on the Hornsey thefts with a snap that suggested the trivial crimes of the city were being pushed aside to make room for something far older and infinitely darker. He stood slowly, his joints clicking in the chill air of the lounge, and reached for his coat, which hung heavy and smelling of rain and exhaust fumes, acting as a second skin he wore whenever the city demanded its due. Outside, the fog had settled low against the ground, clinging to the pavement like grey fur that muffled the solid thud of his boots as he walked to the car. He unlocked the vehicle, the metal key cold enough to burn his fingertips, and slid behind Thuhiel, where the engine coughed twice before catching, shuddering into a rough idle that vibrated up through the steering column into his palms. He pulled away from the curb, the headlights cutting weak, trembling cones through the misto illuminate the net curtains of the terraced houses as he passed, curtains that twitched in the upper windows like pale ghosts shifting behind the lace to watch the police car slide silently through the gloom of their street. Muswell Hill slept with a deceptive peace, the kind of quiet that suggested secrets were being kept rather than simply absent, as Jay navigated the winding roads, with whippers sweeping a rhythmic arc across the windscreen in time with the pounding of his own weary heart. He did not consider the call a mystery. His mind, trained by decades of bureaucracy, categorized it merely as an anomaly, a glitch in theoretically processing of London's waste. Yet the image of the plumber's description of the blockage giving way like meter lodged in his throat as a sour taste no amount of swallowing could dislodge. Turning onto Melrose Avenue, he found the streetlights flickering with a dying yellow glow while a single police car parked haphazardly near the curb flashed its blue light slowly, painting the wet brickwork in pulses of sickly azure. Jay killed the engine and stepped out into the damp air where the smell of wet asphalt rose to meet him, thick and metallic. Hallett waited by the gate with his uniform collar turned up against the chill, his breath blooming in short, sharp clouds as he nodded towards the rear of the property where a portable halogen lamp cast long, distorted shadows against the back wall of the house. "The landlord is in the kitchen, sir," shaking like a leaf and refusing to go near the backyard, Hallett said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the lamp. "The plumber has gone and left his tools behind, stating he would rather lose his fee than touch the matter again." Jay walked past him, his shoes sinking slightly into the sodden grass of the small garden where the air felt different, heavier, carrying a scent that did not belong to the sewage system of a modern city. It was sweet and cloying, a perfume of decay that had been simmering beneath earth for longer than anyone cared to admit, and he stopped at the edge of the manhole cover which gleamed black in the artificial light. "Have you lifted it?" Jay asked, his voice sounding flat in the stillness. "Not yet, sir. We waited for your arrival," Hallett replied, hovering near the iron circle. Jay crouched despite his knees protesting the movement, peering into the gap where the cover had been slightly loosened. Toughened, the darkness below seemed to breathe, exhaling that same sweet, rotting warmth that coated the back of his tongue with taste of old copper. He straightened Ed up and pulled his coat tighter around his chest, as if to shield himself from the invisible miasma rising from the drains, before ordering them to fetch a rod and bring the landlord out to hear him say the words again. Hallett hesitated, his hand hovering near his belt as if seeking reassurance from Orpon that offered no protection against this particular horror, but Jay dismissed the fear by insisting it was merely a blockage, and they were there to clear pipes rather than write poetry. Even as he spoke the words, Jay knew them to be a lie, while the silence of the house behind him remained absolute. Thinnet curtains in the rear window drawn tight against the light to hide whatever domestic normalcy had once existed within. The neighbors' windows stayed dark, yet felt the weight of their unseen gaze, the collective ignorance of a street that preferred not to know what festered in its soil. So he turned back to Theman Hole, where the smell had become unmistakable, a physical presence pressing against his chest and making his ice water with unshed tears. "Move the cover," Jay ordered, stepping back as Hallett and another officer gripped the iron handles to let them see what the city was trying to hide. The metal shrieked against the rim, a sound like a dying animal, before the cover shifted and the full force of the odor rolled out to meet them. Jay did not flinch, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to drive back to the safety of Histia and the trivial thefts of Hornsey. But instead he stooped forward in Toth's stench to begin the grim work. Thorne stood in the doorway where the kitchen lights spilled out onto the patio stones, a man composed of nervous tics and ill-fitting tweed that smelled of mothballs and stale tobacco. He did not look at the officers or the open manhole, but fixed his gaze on the overgrown laurel bush, as if praying it might swallow him whole. "Mr. Thorne," Jay said, keeping his voice low so it would not carry to the street, "you need to tell me exactly what the plumber saw before he ran." The landlord flinched at the sound of his name, his hands twisting a handkerchief into a tight, white knot that threatened to tear the fabric. "He said it wasn't sludge, Detective," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking on the final syllable like dry wood snapping underfoot. "He put the rods down, maybe 6 feet, and hit something soft, not a rat, not a bag of rubbish. He said it gave way like a ripe fruit." Thorne finally looked up, his eyes wide and wet with a terror that had nothing to do with the cold February air biting at his ankles. "I told him to clear it naturally. I pay the rates. I expect the drains to function," but he dropped the rod and backed out of the house so fast he nearly took the doorframe with him. Thorne gestured vaguely towards the interior, a jerky movement that suggested he feared the house itself might lunge at him. He said he wouldn't touch it again for double the fee, said it felt wrong, said it felt like touching a person. Jay watched the man's hands, noting how they trembled not with grief for any lost soul, but with the visceral panic of a man whose asset had suddenly become a liability. The property value hung in the air between them, heavier than the smell rising from the ground. "Did he say anything else?" Jay pressed, stepping closer until Thorne was forced to lean back against the brickwork to maintain the distance. "He mentioned hair," Thorne said, the word dropping from his lips as if it were contaminated. "Long hair, wrapped around the metal. He said the water came up gray, not black, and that it carried bits of skin, perhaps. I didn't look. I swear to God, I didn't look." Jay nodded once, a sharp dip of the chin that dismissed the landlord's sanctimony without needing to speak it. Hallett moved to the side, his face pale in the halogen glare, waiting for the command that would make this real. The uniformed constable beside him shifted his weight, the rubber soles of his boots squeaking faintly on the wet paving slabs, a small, insignificant sound in the heavy silence. "Right," Jay said, turning his back on Thorne to face the dark circle of the drain. "We lift it properly now, no more peeking." He watched as Hallett and the other officer bent to the task, their muscles straining against the rusted iron that had fused with the earth over decades of neglect. The metal groaned, a deep, resonant complaint that vibrated through the soles of Jay's shoes and up into his shins, before the cover slid sideways with a screech of grinding iron. The smell hit them then, not as a wave but as a solid wall, dense and oily and sweet, with the cloying perfume of flesh that had been cooking in its own juices for weeks. It was distinct from the usual reek of the London sewers, which carried the sharp tang of ammonia and rotting vegetables. This was richer, thicker, a scent that coated the throat and lingered in the nasal passages long after the breath was held. Jay felt his stomach contract, a physical recoil that he suppressed by clenching his jaw until the muscles ached, forcing himself to stand still while the others gagged openly. "Christ," Hallett choked out, turning his head away and covering his mouth with the back of a gloved hand. "It's coming from the bend. It's backed up all the way to the surface." Jay stepped forward, ignoring the instinct to retreat, and shone his torch into the opening. The beam cut through the gloom to illuminate a mass of congealed matter that blocked the pipe entirely, a grotesque plug of grey sludge and unrecognizable organic debris that pulsed slightly with the trapped gas beneath. There were strands of dark material woven through the muck, tangled like seaweed in a tide pool, and the surface of the blockage glistened with a film of fat that reflected the light in sickly, rainbow patterns. "Get the rods," Jay ordered, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, flattened by the effort of maintaining control. "We need to see how far it goes." "Sir, surely we should wait for the divisional surgeon?" Hallett asked, his voice trembling as he looked from the drain to Jay's impassive face. If it's what Thorne says." "There is no if yet, Constable," Jay cut in, sharper than he intended, the stress fraying the edges of his patience. "We establish the facts. We do not stand around waiting for permission to do our jobs. Fetch the rods." Hallett hesitated for a fraction of a second, a silent rebellion against the horror, before nodding and scrambling towards the shed where the tools lay abandoned by the fleeing plumber. The other officer remained by the hole, staring down into the darkness as if hypnotized by the sight of the blockage, his breathing shallow and rapid. Jay crouched again, disregarding the dampness seeping through the trousers of his suit, and peered closer at the mass. The light from his torch revealed a curvature within the sludge, a pale arc that might have been bone softened by the acidic environment of the pipes, or perhaps merely a trick of the shadow and the shifting grease. He reached out with the tip of his pen, touching the surface of the blockage, and felt a resistance that was neither liquid nor solid, but something unsettlingly intermediate, like pressing into cold dough that had been left out too long. The sensation traveled up the metal of the pen and into his fingers, a tactile confirmation of the rot that made his skin crawl. He withdrew the pen and wiped it carefully on a handkerchief, the stain spreading quickly into the white cotton like a bruise blooming on fresh skin. "Be ready," Jay said, standing up and brushing the dirt from his knees, though the gesture was futile against the pervasive grime of the garden. "When you push it, stand back. If there is pressure built up, it will blow." Hallett returned with the long, segmented rods, his movements stiff and jerky as he assembled the lengths on the grass. The metal clicked together, a rhythmic sound that echoed in the small garden, marking the passage of time as the night deepened around them. Thorne had retreated further into the kitchen, closing the door until only a sliver of light remained, a cowardly barrier against the truth festering in his backyard. "Ready, sir," Hallett said, gripping the handle of the rod with both hands, his knuckles white against the black metal. "Push," Jay commanded. Hallett thrust the rod forward, the metal disappearing into the muck with a wet, sucking sound that echoed louder than the wind in the trees. For a moment, nothing happened, the rod meeting the solid resistance of the blockage, and then, with a sudden, violent release, the mass shifted. A gush of grey water erupted from the pipe, splashing over the rim and onto the grass, carrying with it chunks of matter that landed with heavy, wet thuds on the sodden earth. Jay did not move, watching as the water receded slightly to reveal what lay beneath the surface, his torch beam steady despite the hammering of his own heart. The smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable, a physical assault that made his eyes water and his throat close, but he held his ground, forcing himself to look at the contents of the drain while the others turned away. There, amidst the sludge and the roots, lay a hand, or what remained of one. The skin was sloughed off, the bones exposed and bleached by the chemicals, but the shape was unmistakable, the fingers curled in a final, futile grasp against the flow of the water. "Stop," Jay said, his voice barely audible over the dripping of the water. "Don't touch anything else. Cordon it off, now." He looked up at the house, at the dark windows where the net curtains hung motionless, hiding the secrets of the man who lived inside. The silence of the street returned, heavier than before, pressing down on them with the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. Jay knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone, that the night was far from over and that the trivial thefts of Hornsey were a lifetime away. Hallett moved first, fumbling with the roll of white tape, while the other officer stood rigid by the manhole, eyes fixed on the ground as if looking directly at the mess might burn him. The tape unspooled with a dry rattle of plastic, a sharp sound against the wet suck of the drain, and Jay watched the white ribbon stretch across the garden to wrap around the gatepost, a fragile barrier against the curiosity of the street. He knew it would hold no water against the tied-off questions that would come with the morning light. "Higher," Jay said, "waist level, no one steps over it." Hallett adjusted the height, his fingers clumsy in the cold, and tied the end off with a knot that slipped slightly before holding fast. The wind picked up, catching the loose end of the tape and making it flap against the brickwork with a rhythmic snapping sound that matched the beating of Jay's own tired heart. He turned his attention back to the grass, where the chunks ejected from the pipe lay scattered like debris after a storm. They were not merely sludge. Some were solid, dark masses matted with hair and roots, while others were pale and slick, reflecting the halogen light in a way that suggested fat rendered down by heat and time. Jay crouched, ignoring the damp seeping through the wool of his trousers, and used the tip of his torch to nudge a larger piece. It rolled heavily, dense with bone, and left a smear of gray grease on the green blades of grass. The smell was not just decay, it was specific, a sweet cloying scent that reminded him of meat left too long in a butcher's window during a heatwave, mixed with the sharp tang of sewage. He straightened up, wiping the torch on his handkerchief, and felt the weight of the case settling onto his shoulders like a wet coat. This was not one body. The volume of material scattered across the lawn suggested a quantity that could not be accounted for by a single victim, a horrifying arithmetic that multiplied the gravity of the night with every chunk he identified. "Sir," Hallett called out, his voice tight, "Thorne is coming out." The landlord emerged from the back door, stepping cautiously over the threshold as if the house itself might bite him. He wore a dressing gown over his pajamas, the fabric thin and insufficient against the February chill, and his arms were wrapped tightly around his chest. He did not look at the drain. He looked at the grass, at the tape, and then at Jay, his face pale and drawn in the harsh light of the lamp. Is it done?" Thorne asked, his breath pluming in the air. "Can we cover it back up?" "No," Jay said. "This is a crime scene now. Nothing moves, nothing is covered." "But the tenants," Thorne stammered, gesturing vaguely towards the house. "The other flats, they'll smell it, they'll complain." "Let them complain," Jay replied, turning his back on the man to focus on the house again. "Get them out if you have to, but no one goes in or out without my say." He watched the windows of the neighboring properties as he spoke. Lights were flickering on behind the net curtains, yellow squares appearing in the dark, like eyes opening one by one. Silhouettes moved behind the lace, distorted shapes that pressed close to the glass to catch a glimpse of the police activity. They were not horrified, they were curious. The net curtains acted as a semi-permeable barrier, allowing them to see out while hiding their own expressions, a collective voyeurism that felt more intrusive than the cold. Jay recognized the look. It was the same gaze that watched accidents on the motorway, people slowing down to see the wreckage without offering help. Here, the wreckage was in a garden in Muswell Hill, and the neighbors were already compiling their stories for the morning papers. "Constable," Jay said, not turning around. "Log the time, 2:15 a.m., scene secured." "Sir," Hallett confirmed, the scratch of his pencil on the notebook audible in the quiet garden. Jay walked towards the back door of the house, stopping just before the step. The smell was stronger here, seeping out from the cracks in the frame, a pervasive odor that had likely been cooking slowly for months without anyone noticing. He thought of the plumber who had refused to return, the landlord who worried about property value, the neighbors who watched from behind lace. All of them had been close enough to touch the truth, yet none had reached out. The bureaucracy of the city had allowed this to happen, a series of small ignores compounding into a mountain of bones. "Who lives here?" Jay asked, though he already knew the name from the initial call. "Mr. Nilsen," Thorne said, stepping closer yet holding his ground before the cordon. "Top floor." He paused, then added, He's quiet, though he always pays on time." "Is he in?" "I think so, for I heard him moving about earlier." Thorne wrung his hands, the skin red and chapped. "He said he called you about the drain." Jay nodded. The man who called the police to report a blockage was likely the man who caused it. The dissonance was sharp, a jagged edge in the smooth narrative of a concerned citizen. He needed to see Nilsen, not here in the garden, where the cold made everyone erratic, but somewhere contained. The station would be better, controlled. "Stay here," Jay ordered Thorne. "Do not let anyone cross that tape. If the press arrive, you say nothing. You direct them to the press office. Do you understand?" Thorne nodded, looking relieved to have a specific instruction that didn't involve touching the grass. Yes, of course." Jay turned to Hallett, instructing him to get a car around the front. "We need to speak to the resident," he said, emphasizing that it must be done gently. "Bring him to Muswell Hill." "Sir," Hallett said, hesitating, "should we arrest him?" Jay looked at the chunks on the grass, then at the dark window of the top-floor flat. There was no proof yet, not really, just a blocked drain and a smell, enough to hold him for questioning, but not enough to charge. The law was a slow machine, and it required fuel before it would turn. "Not yet," Jay said. "Just bring him in for assistance. Let's see what he has to say about the plumbing." He walked around the side of the house, his shoes crunching on the gravel path, moving towards the street where the patrol car waited. The air was colder here, away from the halogen lamp, and the fog had thickened, clinging to the pavement like wet wool. He could hear the distant sound of a lorry shifting gears on the main road, a reminder that the city continued its indifferent rhythm regardless of the bones in the sewer. The net curtains twitched as he passed, the neighbors tracking his movement, storing the detail for later. Jay ignored them, focusing on the door of the car, on the warmth of the engine, on the next step in a night that had only just begun. He opened the door and slid into the seat, the leather cold against his back, and waited for Hallett to bring the man down. The file on the dashboard was still open to the Hornsey thefts, a petty crime sheet that now looked like a joke written in a foreign language. He closed it. The page was turned. The grey light of dawn did not break so much as it leaked, seeping into the sky above Muswell Hill with a reluctance that matched the mood on the pavement. By 7 o'clock, the street had lost its nocturnal secrecy, revealing the peeling paint on the window frames and the damp patches blooming on the brickwork like slow bruises. Jay stood before number 23, the search warrant folded in his pocket, a piece of paper that felt dangerously light against the heavy certainty in his gut. He had not slept. The hours between the garden discovery and this return had been filled with the frantic scratching of pens and the low hum of telephone lines, yet the image of those grey chunks on the grass remained fixed behind his eyes, unblinking. "Ready yourselves," he said, his voice rough from smoke and lack of use. 2 constables flanked him, their uniforms crisp and stiff, contrasting with the rumpled exhaustion of the detective. They moved up the path not with the swagger of raiders, but with the tentative steps of men approaching a sleeping dog they knew to be vicious. The front door was painted a glossy black, immaculate, the brass knocker polished to a shine that caught the weak morning sun. It looked untouched by the rot festering merely feet away in the rear garden. Jay raised his hand and knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed inside the narrow hall. The weight stretched, thin and taut. A bird chirped somewhere overhead, an ordinary sound that felt obscene in the context of what lay behind the door. Then the lock turned. The mechanism clicked with a precise, oiled smoothness, suggesting a homeowner who maintained his hinges as diligently as his appearance. The door swung open. Nilsen stood there. He wore the same suit he had worn the night before, a dark, sensible 2-piece that hung on his frame without a wrinkle. His hair was combed back, neat and dry, and his face held an expression of mild, polite inquiry, as if he were expecting a delivery of groceries rather than the police. There were no shadows under his eyes, no sign of the panic that usually gripped a man when the law arrived at dawn. He looked rested. He looked bored. "Detective Chief Inspector," Nilsen said, stepping back to allow them entry. "I wondered if you would be returning." Jay crossed the threshold, his boots leaving faint marks on the pristine linoleum. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of lemon polish and a cloying chemical disinfectant that burned the back of the throat. It was a smell designed to cleanse, to scrub away evidence, yet beneath it lay something else. A sweet, heavy odor, like meat left too long in a sealed jar, seeped from the walls themselves, permeating the fresh scent of the polish. It was the smell of the house breathing. "We have a warrant to search the premises," Jay said, handing over the document while keeping his eyes fixed on the man. "Regarding the blockage," he added, "and other matters." Nilsen took the paper, glanced at it briefly, and placed it on a small table beside a vase of artificial flowers. The gesture was courteous, administrative. "Of course, I have nothing to hide, Detective. The plumbing is a nuisance, I admit, but I am sure we can sort it out." He led them into the front room. The space was arranged with a fastidious symmetry. The magazines on the coffee table were stacked by size, the cushions on the sofa plumped to identical fullness. Dust motes danced in the light filtering through the net curtains, which were drawn just so, allowing the outside world to be seen but not invited in. Jay walked to the fireplace. The grate was empty, scrubbed clean of ash, the metal bars gleaming. Yet when he leaned closer, he could see a dark, greasy residue deep within the chimney breast, a carbonized history that no amount of brushing could fully erase. "It's very tidy," Jay said, the words slipping out before he could check them. "I like order," Nilsen replied, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. "Chaos is uncomfortable. Don't you find, Detective, that a messy environment leads to a messy mind?" Jay turned from the fireplace. The contrast was violent. The domestic serenity of the room clashed with the knowledge of the dismembered flesh rotting in the garden and the drains. This man, who spoke of chaos as an inconvenience, had created a slaughterhouse and kept the carpet clean. It challenged every instinct Jay had developed over 20 years in the force. Criminals usually left a trail of disorder, of frantic mistakes and spilled emotions. Nilsen had left only a blocked drain and a polite invitation to enter. "Where did you say the blockage was worst?" Jay asked, moving towards the hallway. "In the kitchen sink, primarily," Nilsen said, following them with a calm, gliding pace. "And the bath upstairs. The water goes down very slowly. I assumed it was hair, or perhaps grease from cooking." He said it without a flicker of deception, his tone flat and factual, as if discussing a filing error at the office. Jay felt a rise of nausea, a cold bile that threatened to breach his composure. He swallowed it down, focusing on the texture of the wallpaper, the pattern of the rug, anything to ground himself in the physical reality of the moment. The team began to move through the house, opening cupboards, checking behind doors, their movements slow and deliberate. They were looking for blood, for bone, for the terrible clutter of murder, but found only shelves of tinned food and stacks of neatly folded towels. "Upstairs," Nilsen volunteered, pointing to the staircase. "The bath is there. Perhaps you can see the problem yourself." Jay nodded to Hallett, who began to ascend the stairs, his hand hovering near his belt. The detective remained in the hallway, watching Nilsen watch the police. The man did not fidget. He did not glance at the door as if calculating an escape. He stood in the center of his clean, ordered world, waiting for them to find what he already knew was there. The silence in the house was not empty. It was full, pressing against the eardrums, waiting to be broken by the crash of discovery. "Show us," Jay said. Nilsen smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his eyes, and turned towards the stairs. "This way, then. Do mind the step. It's a bit uneven." He led them up into the belly of the house, towards the bathroom where the water still sat, grey and stagnant, waiting to swirl away the last of the secrets. The bathroom door opened onto a tile-white smallness that smelled strongly of pine disinfectant. Water stood in the bath, grey and stagnant, a film of scum coating the porcelain where the level had settled overnight. Nilsen stepped past Jay to point at the plug hole, his finger hovering an inch above the surface without touching the water. "Here," he said, "the flow is restricted. I used the rods myself, but something remains lodged deep in the U-bend. Jay looked at the water. It did not swirl. It held the light flatly, refusing to reflect the ceiling bulb, and beneath the chemical pine lay that same sweet, cloying weight that had greeted them in the hallway. He opened his notebook, the cardboard cover damp from the humidity of the house, and pressed the nib to the page. The scratch of the pen sounded loud in the tiled room, a dry friction against the wet silence. "How long has the drain been slow?" Jay asked. He kept his voice level, anchoring it to the mundane inquiry so it would not break. "Several weeks, perhaps a month." Nilsen turned from the bath to face them, leaning back against the wash basin with his arms folded across his chest. "I assumed it was hair. Young men leave a lot of hair. It binds together when wet." Young men, the words hung in the air, specific and uncorrected. Hallett shifted his weight near the door, the floorboard creaking under his shoe, but Nilsen did not glance towards the sound. He watched Jay write, waiting for the next question with the patience of a clerk awaiting a signature. Jay felt the bile rise in his throat, a hot acid tide that he forced back down by focusing on the pattern of the tiles, the chip in the corner near the radiator. To vomit here would be to lose the room, to surrender the ground to this man who spoke of bodies as blockages. "Show me the rest," Jay said. He closed the notebook with a snap that echoed off the walls. Nilsen nodded, pushing himself away from the basin. "The front room is more convenient for the larger items. The bathroom is only for the fluids." They descended the stairs. The movement was slow, a procession down the narrow throat of the house, with Nilsen leading and the police following in his wake. In the front room, the light had shifted slightly as the cloud cover outside thickened, dulling the dust motes that floated above the carpet. Nilsen stopped by the fireplace, the same one Jay had inspected moments before, and tapped the hearth with the toe of his shoe. "Here," Nilsen said, explaining that he had burned them on the fire. "It takes time, for the bones do not catch easily." Jay looked at the grate. It was empty, swept clean of ash, the metal bars gleaming with polish. Yet the residue deep in the chimney breast remained, a black, greasy deposit that clung to the brickwork like soot from 1,000 coal fires. He knelt, ignoring the protest of his knees, and leaned closer to the opening. The smell was stronger here, concentrated in the brick, a carbonized history that no brush could fully erase. He could see fragments, small and white, wedged between the iron bars where the sweeping brush had missed. "You used this grate for human remains," Jay said. He did not look up. He spoke to the floor, to the ash, anything to avoid seeing Nilsen's face. "Yes, it was efficient. The heat rises, you see. It draws the smoke up the flue." Nilsen stood with his hands clasped behind his back again, adopting the posture of a guide showing a tenant the features of a rental property. "I had to break them down first. The flesh burns quickly, but the structure requires more fuel. Coal helps, so does paper." Jay straightened up, his spine clicking audibly in the quiet room. He wiped his hands on his trousers, though he had touched nothing, feeling the phantom grit of the ash on his skin. Hallett was standing by the window, looking out through the net curtains at the street below, where a milk lorry passed slowly, the clink of bottles audible through the glass. The normalcy of the street clashed with the words spoken in the room, a dissonance that made Jay's head ache. "Where did you keep them?" Jay asked, "before burning?" "In the cupboard," Nilsen said, turning to the fitted unit beside the chimney breast. He opened the door. Inside, shelves held stacks of clean towels, folded into perfect squares, and rows of tinned food arranged by label size. Behind the towels, I wrapped them in plastic to contain the odor. It worked for a time. Jay stepped forward to look into the cupboard. The towels were white, pristine, smelling of laundry powder. Behind them, the wood of the shelf was stained dark, a damp patch that had soaked into the particle board. He reached out and touched the stain. It was greasy, cold. "You stored them here," Jay said, "in the living room." "It was warm," Nilsen replied, explaining that the cold slows the process. He preferred them near the fire. Jay stepped back, pulling his hand away as if the wood had burned him. He opened his notebook again, the pages filling with words that felt inadequate to the task, clumsy tools trying to measure an abyss. His hand trembled slightly, a fine vibration in the fingers that he hid by gripping the pen harder. This was not a crime scene of passion, of blood spattered in anger or desperation. It was a system, a methodology. Nilsen had built an assembly line for the dead within a terraced house in Muswell Hill, and he was explaining it with the pride of a man who has optimized a filing system. "The garden," Jay said. "You mentioned the garden." "Behind the shed," Nilsen said. "I buried some there. The soil is clay. It holds the shape well." "And the drains?" "Most went down the drains." Nilsen checked his watch, a simple wristwatch with a leather strap. "I find the water carries them away if they are small enough. The blockage is merely a matter of volume, too much at once." Too much at once. The phrase landed with the weight of a stone. Jay closed the notebook. The information was there, recorded in his own handwriting, yet it felt unreal, a fiction drafted in a clean room by a polite man. He needed to see the clay. He needed to see the pipes. Words were not enough. The bureaucracy of the law required physical evidence, bones that could be weighed and measured in a courtroom. "We will need engineers," Jay said, more to himself than to Nilsen. And then he added that they would require forensic teams because the house must be dismantled. Nilsen shrugged, a slight lifting of the shoulders that suggested indifference to the destruction of his home. "If you must, I assume you will be billing me for the repairs." Jay did not answer. He walked to the window, standing beside Hallett, and looked out at the street. The milk lorry was gone. A woman walked a dog on the pavement, pulling the lead tight as she passed the house. She glanced up, seeing the men in the window, and quickened her pace, pulling the dog closer to her side. She knew, or she suspected. The net curtains distorted her face, making her features blur into the pattern of the lace, but the urgency of her walk was clear. "Take him downstairs," Jay said to Hallett, instructing him to keep the man in the kitchen, where he must not be allowed to touch anything. "Sir," Hallett said. He placed a hand on Nilsen's arm, a gesture of restraint that Nilsen accepted without resistance. "May I have a cup of tea?" Nilsen asked as he was led towards the door. "It has been a long morning." Jay watched them leave. The front door closed, cutting off the sound of their footsteps, leaving him alone in the front room with the smell of polish and rot. He looked at the fireplace, at the cupboard, at the clean towels hiding the stain. The house stood silent around him, holding its breath, waiting for the hammer blows that would tear the walls apart. He picked up the telephone on the side table, the dialing tone buzzing softly in his ear, and began to request the heavy equipment needed to break the floor. The dialing tone buzzed, a sharp electric inset in the quiet room. Jay waited for the connection, his fingers tracing the rotary dial's cold plastic until the click of the exchange landed in his ear. He spoke to Divisional HQ, requesting structural engineers and a forensic team with the flat tone of a man ordering skip higher, though the words caught in his throat like grit. Authorization forms lay spread across the side table, white paper stacked against the dark wood, pristine sheets waiting for ink that would sanitize the destruction of a home. He picked up the pen. The nib scratched against the grain, leaving a trail of black ink that bound him to the dismantling of the walls around him. Outside, the first blow landed. An engineer in overalls stood in the garden, swinging a lump hammer against the exterior brickwork to test the load-bearing limits. The sound traveled through the frame, a dull thud that shook the pictures on the wall, dislodging dust from the picture rails. Jay flinched, though he remained at the table, signing the third form in the stack. Each signature felt like a concession, a permission slip granted to the state to tear apart a private life, yet the life inside had already been stripped bare by the man currently sitting in a cell down the road. The bureaucracy required paper trails for the dead just as it did for the living, boxes ticked to justify the expense of digging up a garden or smashing through a floor. He capped the pen. The click sounded too loud in the room. Hallett returned from the station, bringing with him a gust of cold air from the street and a message that sat heavy in the doorway. He held a notepad against his chest, shielding the words from the light as if they were classified intelligence rather than the petty concerns of a killer. "He's asking about his tax records," Hallett said. He did not look at Jay, focusing instead on a stain on the carpet near the fireplace. "And his P60s, he wants to know if they'll be returned intact." Jay stared at the constable. The request was so mundane, so utterly divorced from the blood soaking into the particle board behind the towels, that it momentarily stole the air from the room. Nilsen worried about income tax, while the walls echoed with the sound of hammers testing the space where bodies had been stacked. It was a deflection so complete it bordered on a different species of consciousness, one where human life and fiscal paperwork held equal weight on the ledger. "Tell him his effects will be logged," Jay said, his voice sounding rough and unused, as if it hadn't been employed in days. "Everything goes into evidence." "He mentioned the tea," Hallett added, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Said it would go cold." "Let it go cold." Hallett nodded, scribbling the instruction down, and retreated to the kitchen to relay the message. Jay listened to his footsteps fade, replaced by the rhythmic knocking from the garden. Thud, pause, thud. The house vibrated with the impact, a heartbeat forced upon the structure by men who needed to know where to dig. Plaster dust drifted down from the ceiling, settling on the shoulders of Jay's coat like grey snow. He brushed it off, watching the particles float in the shaft of light cutting through the window. The street outside remained deceptively quiet, the woman with the dog long gone, replaced by the stillness of a neighborhood holding its breath. He moved to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The engineer swung the hammer again, a violent arc that chipped the brickwork, sending fragments skittering across the patio stones. Below in the garden, the soil looked undisturbed, a patch of brown clay hiding the shape of the dead beneath the surface. Jay knew what lay there. He had heard the confession, recorded the words in his notebook, yet the earth gave nothing away. It sat passive, waiting for the spades to break the skin. The contrast between the violence of the recovery and the calm of the suburban street created a dissonance that made his teeth ache. Inside, the cupboard stood open, the white towels still folded in perfect squares, hiding the dark stain on the shelf behind them. A domestic scene corrupted by the knowledge of what had been stored there, like meat in a larder. The telephone rang, shattering the quiet. Jay lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was from the press office, alerting him to the gathering crowd outside the cordon. Reporters had caught the scent, drawn by the uniformed cars and the engineer's van parked on the double yellow lines. They would want names. They would want confirmation of the rumors already circulating among the neighbors. Whispers passed over garden fences about the man in the top flat who kept to himself. Jay listened, nodding though the man could not see him, tracing the rim of the telephone dial with his thumb. There was no protocol for this magnitude of horror, no template for telling the public that a civil servant had turned his home into a charnel house. "Keep them back," Jay said. "No statements until the excavation is complete." "They're asking about the smell," the voice replied. "Says it's been reported for weeks." "Log it." He replaced the receiver. The line went dead, but the buzzing remained in his ear, a phantom noise that matched the vibration of the hammer blows outside. He turned away from the window, walking back to the table where the forms lay. The ink was dry now, the authorization complete. The house belonged to the investigation, no longer a home but a crime scene to be dissected layer by layer. He picked up his notebook, checking the pages where Nilsen's words were recorded. Too much at once. The phrase stared back at him, an admission of volume that suggested more bodies than the garden could hold. The drains, the chimney, the cupboards, each location required a team, a schedule, a budget. The machinery of justice was slow, grinding its gears against the urgency of the dead who wanted to be found. Hallett came back into the room, holding a cup of tea that had been poured for Nilsen. The liquid was dark, a skin already forming on the surface. "He wouldn't take it," Hallett said. He set the cup down on the table next to the signed forms, said he'd wait for a fresh pot. Jay looked at the tea. The steam had vanished, leaving the liquid stagnant, a mirror of the case itself stalling while the paperwork processed. He pushed the cup aside, the ceramic scraping against the wood. "Get the team in," Jay said, instructing them to start with the floorboards before moving on to the garden. "Sir," Hallett hesitated, his hand on the door handle. "There's a woman on the phone, down at the station, asking about a son who hasn't come home." Jay froze. The hammer outside struck again, the vibration traveling up through the floor and into the soles of his shoes. He looked at Hallett, seeing the hesitation in the constable's eyes, the reluctance to deliver news that would turn a missing person report into a recovery operation. "Take her details," Jay said. His voice was low, barely audible over the thud of the hammer. "I'll call her back." Hallett nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Jay stood alone in the front room, the smell of polish and rot mingling in the air. The tea sat cooling on the table, the skin thickening as the minutes passed. Outside, the hammering continued, rhythmic and relentless, breaking the silence of the house piece by piece. He walked to the window again, looking out at the street where the first press van was now parking, the engine idling, exhaust fumes drifting across the pavement. The driver stepped out, lighting a cigarette, looking up at the house with the hungry gaze of a man who knew a story was breaking. Jay drew the curtain, blocking the view, but the sound of the hammer remained, echoing in the walls like a pulse that would not stop. The first board gave way with a splintering crack that sounded less like wood breaking and more like a bone snapping under a heavy boot. Dust billowed up, thick and grey, carrying the scent of decades of trapped tobacco smoke and something far older, far wetter, that had been waiting beneath the carpet for permission to breathe. Jay adjusted the strap of his mask, the elastic digging into the flesh behind his ears, though he knew the thin fabric offered no real defense against the smell rising from the void. It was a cloying, sweet stench, reminiscent of overripe fruit left in the sun, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and the damp earth of a grave that had never seen the sky. "Careful with the crowbar," Jay said, his voice muffled by the mask. "We do not know what is down there." The workman, a broad-shouldered man named Evans, whose face was already streaked with grime, paused and looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, watering against the assault on his senses, but he nodded and shifted his grip on the iron tool. He leveraged the wood again, this time with less force, peeling the board back as if it were the lid of a coffin rather than flooring in a Muswell Hill terrace. Beneath, the darkness was absolute, a hollow space where the subfloor had been dug out by hand, the soil disturbed and packed down with a terrible purpose. A flashlight beam cut through the dust, illuminating the edges of the pit, revealing the pale curve of something that did not belong in the foundations of a home. "Christ," Evans whispered. The word hung in the air, swallowed quickly by the heavy silence of the room. Jay stepped closer, his shoes crunching on the debris of plaster and wood chips. He forced himself to look down, to accept the reality of the shallow grave hidden beneath the domestic routine of tea and television. There were layers of plastic sheeting, torn and yellowed with age, wrapped around shapes that retained the rough outline of human limbs. The plastic had preserved some of the tissue, keeping it in a state of suspended decay, while other parts had dried to a leathery texture, black and shriveled like old parchment. It was a grotesque larder, a storage solution for a problem that had grown too large to ignore, now exposed to the harsh light of the forensic lamps being set up on tripods. "Bag them as you find them," Jay instructed, turning to the pathologist who was kneeling at the edge of the hole, latex gloves snapping against his wrists. "Do not separate the remains, keep the context." The pathologist, a woman with a severe bob and a gaze that missed nothing, leaned over the void. She used a pair of forceps to lift a corner of the plastic, her movements precise and detached, as if she were examining a specimen in a lab rather than unearthing a dead man from a living room floor. "There are multiple layers," she noted, her voice steady despite the odor that was beginning to permeate the room, seeping through the masks and settling in the back of the throat. "He buried them one on top of the other, like logs in a stack." Jay felt a coldness settle in his stomach, a physical weight that had nothing to do with the February chill drafting up from the subfloor. He watched as the team began the slow, agonizing process of extraction, lifting the wrapped bundles with a reverence that contrasted sharply with the violence of their discovery. Each movement was deliberate, recorded by cameras that flashed in the dusty gloom, capturing the moment the dead were returned to the world of the living. It was a bureaucratic ritual, a box-ticking exercise in the face of an atrocity that defied the neat categories of the penal code. "How many?" Evans asked, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He looked at Jay, seeking a number that would make sense of the horror, a statistic that could be filed and forgotten. Jay did not answer immediately. He looked at the pile of plastic-wrapped forms growing on the tarpaulin beside the hole, a mound of human tragedy that seemed to grow with every passing minute. The house felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the truth of what had happened here expanded to fill every corner. "We do not know yet," he said finally. "Just keep digging." The work resumed, the sound of scraping tools and soft curses filling the air. Jay stepped back, moving towards the window where the net curtains still hung, filtering the grey afternoon light into a dull, patterned haze. Outside, the street was quiet, the neighbors keeping their distance behind their own doors, pretending not to hear the sounds of destruction coming from number 23. They would tell themselves it was renovation work, a bit of structural repair, anything to avoid acknowledging the darkness that had festered next door for years. The net curtain fluttered slightly in the draft from the window frame, a ghostly barrier between the safety of the pavement and the charnel house within. Hallett appeared in the doorway, his face pale, holding a clipboard against his chest as if it were a shield. He did not enter the room, stopping at the threshold where the smell was less intense. "Sir," he said, his voice tight. "The woman on the phone, Margaret Halloway, she's provided a description of the coat her son was wearing, blue denim with a patch on the elbow." Jay turned from the window, the image of the quiet street fading as the reality of the room rushed back in. He looked at the pile of remains, wondering if one of those plastic-wrapped bundles contained a blue denim coat with a patch on the elbow. The thought made his hands clench at his sides, the nails digging into his palms. Did she say when he was last seen? "January," Hallett replied. "She said he went out for a cigarette and never came back." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, a devastating summary of a life interrupted. A cigarette, a moment of leisure, a final step into the dark. Jay nodded, swallowing the bile that rose in his throat. "Log it," he said, "and tell her we are making progress." "Sir," Hallett said, hesitating before he spoke. "She asked if she could come down to see if she recognizes anything." "No," Jay said, the word sharp and final, insisting that she cannot come here, not yet. Hallett nodded, accepting the order though his eyes betrayed a flicker of sympathy. He turned to leave, but stopped when Jay spoke again. "Hallett, so—" "Get me a fresh cup of tea," Jay said, looking back at the hole in the floor where the workmen were lifting another bundle, this one smaller than the rest, perhaps a child or just a fragment of a larger whole. "And throw that skin-covered one away, it tastes like the dead." Hallett vanished, leaving Jay alone with the sound of the excavation. The rhythm of the work had changed, becoming more urgent now that the first of the dead had been named, even if only by association. The dust motes danced in the beam of the forensic lights, swirling in the updraft from the open floor, carrying the scent of the grave into every corner of the house. Jay took a deep breath, the smell filling his lungs, staining him from the inside out. He knew he would carry this odor with him long after the house was cleared, long after the trial was over and the verdict read. It was the smell of the city's silence, finally broken, and it was worse than he had ever imagined. Evans called out from the floor, his voice trembling slightly. "DCI, you need to see this." Jay walked back to the edge of the pit, looking down at the latest discovery. It was not wrapped in plastic like the others. It lay exposed to the air, the bones picked clean by time and the slow chemistry of the soil, arranged in a neat row as if waiting for inspection. A vertebrae, a rib, a skull that stared up at the ceiling with empty sockets. "He kept souvenirs," the pathologist murmured, leaning closer to inspect the arrangement. Or perhaps he was running out of room. Jay watched as the camera flash illuminated the bones, freezing the image for the court records, for the history books, for the families who were waiting for a call that would destroy them. The house groaned around them, the timber settling as if in protest against the violation of its foundations. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, tapping against the window pane, a gentle rhythm that masked the sound of the spoons scraping bone. The excavation had only just begun, and the hill of bones was already higher than anyone had dared to guess. The high-pressure hose hissed, a serpentine sound that cut through the damp air of the rear garden where the drainage inspection chamber lay exposed. Water jetted into the pipe, a forceful white spear meant to dislodge the blockage Nilsen had described with such casual precision during his morning tea. Jay stood back, the spray misting his face, cold and tasting faintly of iron, while two men in yellow rubber suits wrestled the nozzle against the recall. They were not digging now, they were flushing the city's guts, trying to coax the hidden dead from the dark veins of the municipal sewer. Pressure's holding at 2,000, the lead engineer shouted over the roar, his voice muffled by the plastic visor of his hood. But the return flow is sluggish. Something's catching the mesh. Jay watched the collection net suspended beneath the outflow pipe, a coarse Hessian sack stretched over a metal frame, waiting to receive whatever the house refused to keep. At first, only sludge emerged, a thick grey ooze that smelled of wet earth and old soap, the mundane detritus of 1,000 showers and washed dishes. Then the color shifted. The grey deepened to a muddy brown, streaked with fibers that looked disturbingly like hair, clumping together in the cold water before sinking into the bag. "Cut the pressure," Jay ordered, stepping closer despite the mud splashing his trousers. "Let it settle." The engineer killed the engine, and the sudden silence rang in their ears, heavier than the noise had been. The water in the channel slowed to a trickle, carrying with it fragments that caught the weak February light. A piece of femur, no larger than a thumb, tumbled into the net, followed by a shard of something that might have been a tooth, or perhaps just a stone worn smooth by the current. It was a grotesque harvest, reaped not with a scythe but with a plumber's snake and a fireman's hose. Dr. Evans crouched by the net, his gloved hands hovering over the contents without touching them yet. He wore a mask, but Jay knew it offered no real protection against the scent rising now, a sweet, cloying perfume of decay that had been trapped in the pipes for months, perhaps years. "Commingled," Evans said, his voice flat, stripped of any clinical detachment that might have once shielded him. "We cannot separate them here. The water has done its work. It has mixed them all together." Jay looked at the slurry, seeing not evidence but a soup of lost names. These were the boys who had no one to report them missing, the drifters and the runaways whose absence registered on no police ledger until this very moment. They had been dissolved, fragmented, and flushed away, reduced to the consistency of the sewage that surrounded them. The bureaucracy of the Metropolitan Police required a body to open a murder file, a name to pin on a charge sheet, yet here was the physical proof that the system had already failed them long before the first officer arrived. "How many?" Jay asked, though he knew the question was futile. Evans shook his head, using a pair of forceps to lift a small, curved bone from the muck. It dripped grey water onto the paving stones, leaving a stain that would not wash away with rain. "Impossible to say from this. A jawbone here, a vertebra there. They are all mixed in with the root matter, the silt. The Thames will claim most of it eventually, even if we bag it now." The engineer straightened up, peeling off his gloves with a wet snap. "There's more down the line," he said, gesturing towards the manhole cover that led to the main sewer. "The blockage isn't just in this house pipe. It extends 20 feet out. Whatever went in there, it packed tight." Jay felt a sudden, violent urge to turn away, to walk back into the house where the smell was at least honest, a direct assault rather than this insidious seepage into the water table. He thought of the tea in the incident room, the skin forming on the surface as the hours dragged on, a perfect analogue for the stagnation of justice. Here the water moved, but it carried only death. "Bag it all," Jay said, his voice sounding thin against the backdrop of the quiet street. "Every fragment, label it by date and time of recovery. Do not attempt to clean them." "Sir," Evans replied, already reaching for the plastic evidence bags, "the families, some of them might want something back, a piece to bury." Jay looked at the neighbor's fence, where a cat sat watching them with unblinking eyes, indifferent to the excavation of human remains. He thought of Margaret Halloway and her blue denim coat, the patch on the elbow, the cigarette that marked the end of her son's life. What could he give her? A sliver of bone indistinguishable from 100 others, a tooth that might have belonged to a stranger from 3 winters ago. "There is nothing to give them," Jay said, the words tasting like ash. "Not in a way that matters. We can tell them he is gone, we can tell them where, but this," he gestured at the net, heavy with its grisly contents, "this is just waste. It is what happens when people are treated like rubbish." The engineer restarted the pump, a lower setting this time, and the water began to flow again, clearer now, though the smell persisted. It was a futile cleansing, an attempt to wash away a stain that had soaked into the very brickwork of the neighborhood. Jay watched the water swirl, thinking of the baths Nilsen had taken, the ritualistic washing of the dead before they were cut apart, the irony of a man who cared so much for the presentation of the body yet disposed of it like broken plumbing. "DCI," Evans called out, holding up a small plastic bag containing a dark, fibrous mass. Hair long, male pattern by the look of the root. Jay nodded, refusing to look closer. Log it, put it with the rest. He turned his back on the drainage channel, walking towards the rear door of the house. The mud on his boots squelched with every step, a rhythmic reminder of the ground he walked upon, ground that had swallowed so much and given back so little. Inside, the hallway was dim, the light from the garden failing to penetrate the gloom of the narrow corridor. The smell here was different, drier, older, clinging to the wallpaper and the carpet like a second skin. Hallett was waiting by the telephone in the front room, the receiver pressed to his ear, his face drawn and pale. He caught Jay's eye and mouthed a single word, her. Jay stopped, his hand resting on the doorframe, the wood rough under his palm. He knew who it was before Hallett spoke. The anticipation of the call, the dread of the voice on the other end, was a physical weight in his chest, heavier than the wet coat he wore. He had flushed the drains, recovered the bones, and still he had nothing but silence and sludge to offer the living. "Tell her I am coming," Jay said softly, not moving from the shadow of the hall. "Tell her I have something to show her, but not the bones, never the bones." He walked past Hallett, towards the coat rack by the door, where the unclaimed jackets of the missing hung in a row, empty sleeves dangling like the limbs of hanged men. He took his own hat from the peg, placing it on his head with a deliberate slowness, preparing himself for the drive to Muswell Hill, for the moment when he would have to look a mother in the eye and tell her that her son was now part of the sewerage, indistinguishable from the refuse of the city. The rain outside had picked up, drumming against the window, a sound that almost masked the weeping coming from the telephone receiver. Almost. The incident room smelled of stale tobacco and the sour milk of forgotten lunches, a cloying warmth that stuck to the back of the throat. Jay pushed through the door, shaking the rain from his hat, and found the air thicker than the garden had been. Files sprawled across the trestle tables like open wounds, manila folders, bleeding paper clips, and photocopied smiles. In the corner, beneath the flickering fluorescent strip, Margaret Halloway sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the coat rack as if prayer might animate the empty sleeves. She did not look up when he entered. Her gaze remained fixed on the blue denim jacket hanging third from the left, the one with the patch on the elbow her son had stitched himself before vanishing into the grey November of the previous year. Jay stopped by the radiator, peeling off his wet gloves. The heat bit at his fingers, sharp and stinging, but he welcomed the pain. It grounded him. "Mrs. Halloway." She flinched, a small, bird-like movement, before turning her head to reveal eyes that were red-rimmed, the skin around them papery and thin. "You went to the house." It was not a question. "The constable said you were digging." "We are following up on information provided by Mr. Nilsen." Jay kept his voice level, stripping it of inflection. He walked to the table and picked up a plastic evidence bag containing a set of dental charts. The plastic crinkled, a loud, brittle sound in the quiet room. "He has given us locations. We are verifying them." Verifying, she tasted the word, rolling it around her mouth like a sour sweet. "Is that what we call it now? You dig holes and verify." Jay placed the bag on the table between them. He did not sit. Sitting implied a conversation, a negotiation. This was a delivery. "We found remains, Margaret, in the drainage system and beneath the floorboards." She stood up then, her chair scraping against the linoleum with a shriek that made Hallett look up from the far corner. She walked to the coat rack, her movement stiff, and reached out to touch the denim sleeve. Her fingers hovered over the fabric, not quite making contact, as though the garment were radioactive. "He wore this when he left. The patch. You remember I told you about the patch?" "I remember." "If you found him, if you found bones." She turned to face Jay, her hands dropping to her sides, clenched into fists. "Would you know? Can you tell who they are when they are broken?" Jay looked at the dental charts. The black ink swam before his eyes for a second, the rows of molars and incisors reducing a human life to a map of calcium and decay. He thought of the sludge in the net, the hair tangled with roots, the impossibility of separating one boy from another in the dark of the sewer. To tell her the truth was to destroy her. To lie was to condemn her to a lifetime of waiting for a ghost. "We have dental records," Jay said. "Yours match the findings from the house." The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Outside, a lorry changed gear on the main road, the engine groaning under the strain, but inside the room the air was static. Margaret did not cry. She simply absorbed the information, her shoulders dropping an inch as the tension left her body, replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion. She walked back to the table and looked at the plastic bag. "Can I have the coat?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of hope. "If he is not coming back, can I have the coat?" "It is evidence, Mrs. Holloway, for the trial." "The trial?" She laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. "So he gets a trial, and Stephen gets a bag of dust." "It is not dust." Jay stepped forward, instinctively reaching out to steady her, but he stopped himself. His hand hung in the air between them, useless. "We will recover what we can, I promise you that." "Promises?" She turned away from him, walking back to the chair and sinking into it. "You people are very good with promises. They fill the files. They take up space." Jay nodded to Hallett, a signal to pour tea, though he knew the pot was cold. The ritual mattered more than the drink. He moved to the window, looking out at the street where the net curtains twitched in the houses opposite. People were watching. They always watched. He felt a sudden, fierce anger at the row of terraced homes, at the privacy that shielded monsters and neighbors alike. The glass was cold against his forehead. DCI, Hallett stood by the door, holding a fresh file folder. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "There is a statement just came in." Jay turned from the window. "Who from?" "Mrs. Doyle, number 21. Hallett placed the folder on the stack, the thud final, before adding, "She says she wants to speak about the garden, the burning." Although she claimed the smell was sweet, like meat, she had dismissed it as rubbish. Margaret looked up from her hands. "Burning." Jay ignored the question, focusing on Hallett. "Did she say when?" "Several occasions, mostly in November last autumn." Hallett glanced at Margaret before turning back to Jay. "She mentioned complaining to the council once about the smoke, but they told her it was likely garden waste and therefore no violation." Jay felt the weight of the room press in on him, the files, the coats, the woman sitting in the corner holding onto a son who was now part of the sewerage. The bureaucracy had failed Stephen Holloway in life, and it had failed him in death, categorizing the scent of his destruction as routine refuse. He looked at Margaret, who was watching him with a new intensity, her grief sharpening into something harder, something that demanded a target. "Take the statement, Hallett," Jay said quietly, his voice low as he instructed the other man to verify the dates and cross-reference them with the missing persons from that period. "Sir," Hallett hesitated, "and Mrs. Holloway." Jay looked at the woman. She had returned her attention to the coat, her fingers now tracing the seam of the sleeve, a slow, rhythmic motion. She was no longer waiting for her son to walk through the door. She was waiting for justice, and she would find it wanting. "I will drive you home," Jay said to her, "when you are ready." "There is no home," she replied, not looking up. "Not anymore." Jay picked up his hat from the table. The brim was still damp. He thought of the garden at Melrose Avenue, the dark earth, the place where the fire had been. The smoke had risen into the sky, visible and foul, and nobody had looked up. He walked to the door, holding it open for Hallett, but paused before stepping into the corridor. The smell of the burning lingered in his memory, distinct from the sewage, distinct from the stale tea. It was the smell of a community choosing not to see. "Get the car," Jay said to Hallett. "We need to speak to Mrs. Doyle, now." Hallett nodded and moved quickly down the hall, eager to escape the heavy air of the room. Jay turned back to Margaret one last time. She was still touching the coat, her lips moving silently, perhaps counting the stitches on the patch, perhaps praying. He closed the door softly, leaving her with the dead clothes, and stepped out into the corridor where the phone was already ringing, a shrill, demanding sound that echoed off the peeling paint. He ignored it. The smoke was what mattered now. The smoke that had drifted over the fences while the city slept. The incident room smelled of wet wool and the sour metallic tang of old tea leaves left to rot in the bottom of a mug. Not the sharp, clean scent of fresh brew, but the stagnant skin that forms when hope curdles into waiting. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. stood before the far wall, where the photographs hung in a jagged grid, pinned against the peeling magnolia paint with brass tacks that had already begun to tarnish. Faces stared out from the paper, young men mostly. Some smiling with the careless arrogance of youth, others caught mid-laugh, eyes crinkled against a sun that felt a lifetime ago compared to the grey damp of this March afternoon. A few images were blurry, taken from school reports or family albums, the grain softening features until the boys looked like ghosts already, half dissolved into the atmosphere of the room. Jay reached out, his finger hovering inches from a photograph of a lad in a mod haircut, the collar of his jacket turned up against a wind that no longer blew. Stephen Halloway. The name was written in blue biro beneath the image, the ink slightly smudged where a thumb had rubbed against it too many times. Below Stephen, a gap. No picture, no name, just a blank space where a face should be, representing a body pulled from the drains at Melrose Avenue that no mother had yet come to claim. The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy, a physical weight pressing against the eardrums, composed of the low murmur of constables on telephones in the corridor and the scratch of ballpoints on forms that would never result in a reunion. So, Jay did not turn immediately. He watched a dust mote drift through the shaft of light cutting from the high window, settling on the shoulder of the boy in the photograph, as if tucking him in for a sleep from which there would be no waking. The particle joined a layer of grey fuzz accumulating on the pinheads, a slow accrual of neglect that mirrored the weeks, then months. These files had sat on desks, while the city moved on, indifferent to the hollows left behind in North London kitchens. Sir, the cross-reference from Camden is back. It was Hallett, holding a sheaf of papers that looked too thin to hold the weight of so many missing lives. The young constable shifted his stance, boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum, a sound that grated against Jay's nerves like a knife on bone. He wanted to tell the boy to stop moving, to stand still and bear the quiet, but the impulse passed, swallowed by the exhaustion that had taken root in Jay's marrow. "Read it," Jay said, his voice rough, stripped of the inflection that usually softened orders. 3 matches on the timeline, all male, all under 25, all reported between October and January. Hallett flipped a page, the paper crisping loudly in the stillness. One was a runaway, filed by a sister who gave up after a fortnight. The other 2, no next of kin listed, just addresses in hostels that have since closed down. Jay turned then, leaning his hip against the desk, the wood digging into his thigh through the fabric of his trousers. He looked at the wall again, at the sea of faces that seemed to expand every time he blinked, new gaps appearing where names had not yet been found, invisible victims whose absence had not even registered on the bureaucratic radar until the drains at number 23 backed up with flesh. The system was designed to catch the loud, the connected, the people with families who would hammer on the station door until a file was opened, but it let the drifters slip through the mesh, silent and uncounted, until they ended up in the sewerage, tangled with roots and refuse. And the locations: Holloway Road, Caledonian Road, and one near King's Cross. Hallett tapped the paper with a fingernail, all within a mile radius of where he was working at the time, or living, depending on which statement you believe. Jay nodded, a slow, heavy dip of the chin. The geography was tight, a noose drawn around the transient population of the capital, tightening with every bus ride, every night spent in a shelter, every pint bought in a pub where nobody asked questions. He walked the length of the wall, his shoes making no sound on the floor, tracing the invisible lines that connected these points on the map, lines that led inevitably to the small, terraced house in Muswell Hill, where a man had sat in his armchair and listened to the radio while bodies cooled in the room above. The sheer scale of it made his stomach turn, not with nausea, but with a profound, sickening recognition of how easily people could vanish if they lacked the proper anchors to hold them to the earth. "We need to visit the hostels," Jay said, stopping before the blank space where the unidentified victim belonged. "Speak to the wardens, see if anyone remembers them, anything." "The wardens are gone, sir, buildings demolished or repurposed." Hallett's voice dropped, apologetic yet factual. "Records were purged last year, budget cuts." Jay closed his eyes for a second, feeling the throb of a headache starting behind his temples, a dull rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock on the far wall. Budget cuts. The phrase was a euphemism for erasure, a polite way of saying that the state had decided some lives were not worth the paper required to record their passing. He opened his eyes and looked at the photograph of Stephen Halloway again, the only one with a mother who had refused to let go, who had sat in that front room and touched the sleeve of a coat that would never warm a living body again. Without her, Stephen might have been just another gap in the wall, another statistic lost to the drainage system, unremarked and unmourned. Find someone who worked there, Jay said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. Cleaners, local shopkeepers, anyone who saw them come and go. They didn't just evaporate, Hallett. They walked down streets, bought cigarettes, sat on benches. Someone saw them. I'll make inquiries, Hallett said, scribbling on his notepad, the pen scratching frantically. But it might take time. People don't remember strangers easily. They remember when a stranger stops coming, Jay muttered, more to himself than to the constable. He reached out and straightened the corner of Stephen's photograph, smoothing the paper where it had curled slightly from the humidity of the room. The action was futile, a tiny gesture of order against the chaos of death, but it was all he had. The dust motes continued their slow dance in the light, settling on the other faces, on the names written in fading ink, on the empty spaces waiting to be filled. Outside, a lorry rumbled past on the main road, the vibration traveling through the brickwork, shaking the frame on the wall so that the faces seemed to shiver, a collective tremor of the dead demanding to be seen, to be named, to be pulled from the dark water before they were washed away entirely. Jay turned his back on the wall, the image of the smiling boys burning into his retina even as he walked towards the door. The tea on his desk had formed a thick, iridescent skin, cold and untouchable. He left it there, untouched, and pushed open the door to the corridor where the phone was ringing again, a shrill, persistent sound that demanded answers he did not have, for names he had not yet found. The investigation was moving forward, grinding through the gears of the law, but the wall remained, a silent testament to the ones who had slipped through the net, waiting for a voice to speak for them in a room that smelled only of wet wool and regret. The smell of gravy thickening on the stove clung to the back of her throat, sweet and salty and heavy, with the fat of a Sunday that had no right to exist on a Tuesday. Margaret Halloway stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, the handle worn smooth by years of gripping, her knuckles white against the dark varnish. Steam rose in a lazy column, dissipating before it reached the ceiling, carrying the scent of onions and beef stock that would now cool untouched in the pan. She turned the gas down low, the flame clicking to a smaller blue ring, and wiped her hands on the apron tied around her waist. The fabric was stiff with old stains, a map of meals past, of birthdays and Christmases when the table had been full. 2 plates sat on the formica counter, one chipped at the rim, the other whole. She picked up the whole one and carried it to the table, her steps measured on the line. The house held its breath around her, the silence not empty but weighted, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. Outside, the traffic on the main road surged and receded, a distant tide that marked the passing of hours without requiring a clock. She set the plate down opposite her own chair, the ceramic clicking against the surface, a sharp sound that seemed to offend the quiet. A fork was placed beside it. Time's up, just as he liked it. Habit was a cruel thing, moving the limbs when the mind had already accepted the truth. Margaret sat. She pulled her own plate closer but did not lift her fork. The tea in her mug had gone cold, a dark skin forming on the surface that mirrored the stagnation in the room. She had made it 20 minutes ago, intending to drink it while she waited for the telephone to ring, but the receiver remained silent in its cradle on the wall. The plastic was yellowed with age, the cord coiled like a sleeping snake. She looked at it, willing the bell to shatter the air, knowing that when it did, it would not be Stephen on the other end. It would be the police, again, with more questions, with less hope. The clock on the mantel ticked, loud. She stood up abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the floor, a shriek of wood on tile that made her flinch. Walking to the window, she pressed her palm against the glass. It was cold, leaching the warmth from her skin. The street outside was grey, the pavement wet from an earlier shower, reflecting the orange glow of the street lamps that had flickered on too early in the gloom. A neighbor walked a dog further down, head bowed against the damp, ignoring the house where the light burned bright in the middle of the day. They knew, of course they knew. The police cars had been parked outside for hours yesterday, engines idling, men in suits walking up the path with boxes. There were no secrets in a terrace like this, only polite silences and drawn blinds. Margaret turned away from the window. The gravity of the room pulled her back to the table. She sat down and picked up the receiver. Her finger hovered over the dial. The numbers were worn, the white plastic faded where her thumb had rested over the years. She dialed a number she had found tucked inside the Bible last week, written in a shaky hand by a woman named Elaine whose son had vanished in Caledonian Road. The disc spun with a mechanical whir, clicking into place for each digit. The ringing tone buzzed in her ear, rhythmic and impersonal. One ring, two. Hello, the voice was thin, brittle, as if the woman on the other end had been waiting by her own phone for this exact moment. Elaine, Margaret said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, rough from disuse. It's Margaret, Stephen's mother. A pause, the line crackled with static, a tiny storm trapped in the wire. Margaret, did they find something? They found him. Margaret looked at the empty plate opposite her. The gravy on the stove was congealing now, forming a gelatinous layer that would need to be scraped away. At the house, in Muswell Hill. Oh God, Elaine's breath hitched, a wet, ragged sound. Oh Margaret, I'm so sorry, is it definite? They showed me a coat and teeth records. Margaret kept her tone flat, holding the emotions at bay like a door against a gale. It's him, but there are others, Elaine. The detective said there are others, boys who no one is looking for. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the connection. My David, Elaine whispered. He went missing near King's Cross, January. The police said he'd run off, said he was troubled. They said the same about Stephen. Margaret tightened her grip on the receiver. They were wrong, all of them. We need to tell them. We need to make them listen. What can we do? They have the man. They have the confessions. They have a man. They don't have the names. Margaret's voice hardened, gaining an edge she hadn't felt since the first knock on the door. I'm not letting them close the file until every boy is named. I'm going back to the station tomorrow. I want you to come with me. Another pause, longer this time. Margaret could hear the woman breathing, weighing the cost of reopening the wound against the necessity of the act. I'll come, Elaine said. What time? 9, I'll meet you at the gates. Margaret hung up. The click of the receiver was final. She sat back in the chair, the wood creaking under her weight. The kitchen felt different now. The air shifted, charged with a purpose that was not quite grief and not quite anger. It was a demand. She looked at the second plate, the fork still untouched. Slowly, she reached out and turned it over, tines down. The ritual was broken. The waiting was over. She stood and walked to the stove, pouring the cold gravy down the sink. The water swirled away, dark and thick, disappearing into the pipes beneath the floor. She watched it go, thinking of the other pipes, the ones in that house on Melrose Avenue, and what they had carried away. The thought made her shudder, a physical recoil that started in her shoulders and moved down her spine. She turned off the tap. The house was quiet again, but the silence was no longer passive. It was a held breath before a shout. Margaret wiped the table with a cloth, removing the crumbs that weren't there, polishing the formica until it gleamed. She needed to be ready. Tomorrow would require strength she wasn't sure she possessed, but she would borrow it from the women who were walking the same path. She walked into the hallway and picked up her coat from the stand. It was heavy wool, dark blue, the kind that kept out the damp chill of the London autumn. She ran her hand over the sleeve, feeling the texture of the fabric. Stephen's coat was still in the incident room. She knew that. Jay had told her. She would ask for it back tomorrow, not as a plea, but as a right. Margaret switched off the kitchen light. The darkness pooled in the corners immediately, swallowing the chairs, the table, the empty plate. She did not turn on the hallway light. She knew the way to the front door by feel, by the memory of 1,000 departures. Her hand rested on the latch. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the letterbox in the door, a metallic clatter that sounded like a knock. She froze. No one came this late. She opened the door a crack. The street was empty, just the wind pushing leaves across the pavement, but the air smelled of rain and something else, something faintly chemical, like the disinfectant used in hospitals. She closed the door and locked it, turning the key twice. The sound echoed through the hall. Tomorrow she would go to them. She would sit in their rooms and speak the names until their pens ran dry. Margaret walked back into the kitchen and picked up the cold mug of tea. She carried it to the sink and poured it out, watching the dark liquid join the gravy in the drain, 2 losses in one evening. She rinsed the mug and placed it upside down on the rack to dry. The house settled around her, the timbers contracting as the night cooled. She walked towards the stairs, her hand trailing along the banister, feeling the smooth wood worn by generations of grip. At the bottom step, she stopped. The telephone rang. She turned back. The sound was shrill, demanding, cutting through the quiet she had just established. Margaret looked at the machine on the wall. It rang again. She did not move to answer it. She let it ring, counting the intervals, letting the noise fill the space where her son's voice should have been. After the 10th ring, it stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She climbed the stairs. The corridor smelled of boiled cabbage and Wet's 3AE, a scent that clung to the plasterwork like a memory of lunches past. Jay pushed the door to the briefing room open. Inside, the smoke hung low, a grey ceiling beneath the white tiles, trapping the heat of 3 radiators and the bodies of 4 men. Superintendent Grayson sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled over a file that was already closed. 2 other detectives flanked him, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood rather than the man entering the room. Jay pulled out a chair. The legs scraped against the linoleum, a harsh shriek that made Grayson flinch. "You're back," Grayson said. He did not ask how the visit had gone. "Margaret Halloway knows." Jay sat. He kept his coat on, the damp wool heavy on his shoulders. "She's coming in tomorrow with another mother." Grayson sighed, a dry exhalation that ruffled the papers near his elbow. "We have the confession, Peter. Nilsen has taken us to the house. He has shown us the drains. The Crown Prosecution Service wants to charge by Friday." "And the others?" "The others are missing persons, unconfirmed." Grayson reached for his mug. The tea inside had formed a thick, gelatinous skin, opaque and brown. He pushed it away without drinking. "We cannot hunt for ghosts when we have the killer in custody. The resources aren't there." "They are there." Jay leaned forward, palms flat on the table. The wood was cold. "We have the timeline. We have the locations. You want to close the file because it's messy, because digging through the sewerage for bone fragments doesn't look good on a press release." One of the detectives, a younger man named Collins, shifted in his seat. The leather creaked. "Sir, the families, they need something, if there are more." "If there are more, we will find them," Grayson interrupted. His voice was smooth, practiced, the tone of a man who had managed expectations for 20 years. "But we do not expand the scope indefinitely. We secure the conviction, we hang the man, then we worry about the rest." Jay felt the heat rise in his neck, a prickling sensation that had nothing to do with the radiators. He thought of Margaret's hand on the telephone receiver, the way her voice had hardened when she spoke of names. She was borrowing strength she did not possess. He was expected to tell her that the strength was wasted. "They aren't statistics." Jay's voice was quiet, but it carried. "They are boys. Some of them had mothers like Mrs. Halloway, some had no one. That doesn't mean they don't count." Grayson opened the file. He tapped a pen against the paper, a rhythmic clicking that filled the space between them. "In this force, we follow procedure. Procedure dictates we prioritize the identifiable victims to secure the trial. Anything else is a distraction." "It's negligence." "It's policing." Grayson looked up. His eyes were tired, the skin beneath them bruised with lack of sleep. "Do not mistake bureaucracy for indifference, Peter. We are trying to ensure a conviction. If we scatter our efforts chasing every runaway report from the last 5 years, the defense will tear us apart. They will say we coerced the confession. They will say we planted evidence to fit the narrative." The argument hung in the smoke, heavy and suffocating. Jay looked at the cold tea in front of him. A fly had landed on the surface, trapped in the skin, legs twitching as it tried to find purchase on the liquid film. It struggled, sank slightly, then stopped moving. "We have a duty to the dead," Jay said. "We have a duty to the living," Grayson countered. "To the families who need closure, to the public who need to know the streets are safe. Closing this case quickly achieves that." Quickly, Jay tasted the word. It felt like ash. "You want to bury them with him." "I want to bury the case." Grayson closed the file with a snap. "Meeting adjourned." "Get some rest, Peter. You look like hell." The chairs scraped back. Collins stood first, eager to escape the tension, and moved quickly to the door. The other detective followed, avoiding Jay's gaze. Grayson remained seated, watching Jay over the top of his glasses, waiting for him to leave. Jay stood, his knees cracked, a dry sound like twigs snapping underfoot. He did not say goodbye. He walked to the door, his hand brushing the frame as he passed, feeling the paint rough against his palm. The corridor outside was dimmer than the briefing room, the lights on a timer that had already clicked down to half power. Shadows stretched long across the floor, reaching for his ankles as he walked. He stopped at the junction. Left led to the exit, to the street, to the cold air and the drive home where a wife waited with a dinner that would grow cold in the oven. Right led to the evidence room, where the possessions of the dead were stored in plastic bags and cardboard boxes. Jay turned right. The floor changed from linoleum to concrete, colder under his shoes. The air here smelled of dust and old paper, a dry scent that coated the back of the throat. He passed rows of filing cabinets, their labels faded, some peeling away at the corners like dead skin. A single bulb hung from the ceiling at the far end, flickering slightly, casting a strobe effect on the metal shelving units. He reached the door marked Exhibits. It was locked. He pulled the key from his pocket, the metal warm from his hand, and slid it into the lock. The tumblers clicked, a heavy mechanical sound that echoed in the narrow hall. He pushed the door open. Inside, the racks waited. Coats hung in rows, zippers pulled up to the collar, sleeves hanging empty. They were not arranged by size or color, but by date of recovery, a chronology of loss stitched in wool and synthetic blend. Jay stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. The latch clicked. He was alone with the things that remained. He walked down the aisle, his hand trailing along the sleeves, a denim jacket, a leather blouson, a heavy parka with a fur-lined hood. Each one held the shape of a body that was no longer there, a hollow shell waiting to be filled. He stopped at a gray overcoat, the fabric worn at the elbows. He touched the shoulder. It was cold. Somewhere in the building, a telephone began to ring. It was distant, muffled by walls and doors, but it persisted, a shrill demand in the quiet. Jay did not move to answer it. He stood in the dim light, surrounded by the clothes of men who would not be coming home, and listened to the phone ring until it stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the file Grayson had closed. The cover was plain manila, unmarked except for a reference number stamped in blue ink. Jay opened it. Inside, the prosecution's timeline was laid out in neat typescript, the dates circled in red pen. The trial was set for October. The leaves would be falling when the verdict came down. Jay ran a finger over the date, October, 7 months away. He closed the file and placed it on a shelf next to a pair of boots that had been scrubbed clean of mud. The leather was cracked, dry from lack of polish. He turned off the light. The darkness swallowed the coats, the boots, the file, leaving only the smell of dust and the memory of the men who had worn them. Jay stepped out into the corridor and locked the door. The key turned twice. He walked towards the exit. The night air waited outside, cold and damp, promising nothing. Rain need not fall for the air to feel wet. It hung in Muswell Hill, a grey suspension of mist that clung to wool coats and settled deep into the brickwork, making the terrace houses sweat from the inside out. Detective Chief Inspector Peter Jay stood on the pavement outside number 19, watching his constable knock. The sound was polite, a rhythmic tapping of knuckles against wood that belonged to a different era, before fear had rewired the reflex to open. Nothing happened. The constable knocked again, harder this time, the report of bone on varnished pine cutting through the damp stillness. A shadow shifted behind the glass pane set above the letterbox, a distortion moving through the lace. Jay shifted his weight, the sole of his shoe squelching softly against the grit-strewn path. He hated this part. The excavation of drains, the sifting of sludge, even the cold bureaucracy of the incident room offered a tangible enemy, a problem with edges that could be grasped and solved. This was different. This was asking neighbors to admit they lived beside a monster without seeing him, and the shame of that blindness made them clamp shut like oysters. The door opened a crack, the chain pulled tight across the frame. An eye appeared, blue and watery, sweeping his gaze across the warrant card held up by the constable before flicking to Jay standing in the gloom behind. Police, the voice was thin, reedy, as if the speaker had not used it for days. Detective Chief Inspector Jay, he said, keeping his tone level, stripping away the weariness that wanted to slump his shoulders. We are speaking to everyone on the street again. Just a few questions about your neighbor at 23. The eye narrowed. The chain rattled as the person behind the door leaned closer, the smell of boiled cabbage and stale tobacco leaking through the gap. I told the other one, last week, don't know nothing, never saw nothing. The other officer was Constable Miller. I'm sure he noted your statement, Jay said, stepping forward until his own shadow fell across the threshold, invading the sliver of warm light spilling from the hallway. But things change. New information comes to light. Sometimes people remember details they thought were unimportant at the time. Like what? Smells, sounds, visitors. Jay kept his hands visible, resting them loosely at his sides, a gesture of peace that felt performative and hollow. Did you notice anything unusual in the garden? Smoke, perhaps, or the sound of digging? The woman behind the door hesitated. Her grip on the edge of the wood tightened, knuckles whitening against the dark stain. She looked past Jay, down the street where the other houses stood in a uniform row, their windows dark, their curtains drawn against the evening. The lace patterns blurred the view, turning the world outside into a soft, indistinct mesh where nothing sharp could penetrate. It's a quiet street, she said finally, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the hum of a distant bus on the main road. People keep to themselves. That's how it is here. You don't pry. And did anyone pry? Jay pressed, gentle but insistent, pushing against the wall of reticence. Did anyone ask questions about the comings and goings at number 23? No, the word was sharp, a deflection meant to end the conversation. We mind our own business. It's better that way. She began to close the door, the movement slow and deliberate, the chain scraping against the wood. Jay felt a spike of frustration, hot and sudden, but he suppressed it, letting his face remain a mask of professional neutrality. He needed her to talk, needed to crack the veneer of respectability that coated the street like lichen, but force would only make the shell harder. Mrs. Gable, he said, reading the name from the brass plate beside the bell, though he had not seen it until this moment. We found things in the drains, things that shouldn't be there. If you know something, anything at all, now is the time to say it. Not for us, for the boys who aren't coming home. The door stopped moving. The chain went slack. For a heartbeat, the silence stretched, taut and vibrating, filled only by the sound of the woman's breathing, shallow and quick. Then the door opened wider, the chain still on, but the gap sufficient to see a sliver of her face, pale and lined with a worry that went deeper than mere nuisance. Boys, she whispered, the word catching in her throat. I thought, they said it was a blockage, just pipes. It was more than pipes, Jay said, his voice low, forcing the truth into the space between them. And we think it happened over a long time, weeks, maybe months. Did you smell anything? Sweet, like burning meat or rotting flowers. Mrs. Gable flinched. Her hand moved to her mouth, covering it as if to hold back a gasp. She looked back into her own hallway, towards the kitchen perhaps, where the scent of her own dinner still lingered, suddenly tainted by the suggestion of another. There was a smell, she admitted, the words tumbling out now, rushed and fearful. Last autumn, bonfire night maybe later, I thought it was damp wood or a fox caught in a trap. It lasted for days. I complained to my husband, but he said it was just the wind carrying it from elsewhere. Where did it seem to come from? Jay asked, leaning in, his entire focus narrowing to this single thread of sensory memory. From the back, she said, pointing a trembling finger towards the rear of the terrace, where the gardens merged into a tangled patchwork of fences and overgrown shrubs. From his garden, but there was no fire, no smoke to speak of, just the smell. Jay nodded, a slow, heavy motion. The piece clicked into place, fitting the grim puzzle with a precision that made his stomach turn. The bonfire smoke, the acrid sweetness of destruction, drifting over the fence, while neighbors mistook it for routine refuse clearing. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, he said softly. You've been very helpful. We may need to speak again. She nodded, her eyes wide and watery, already retreating behind the barrier of her own denial. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. The door closed, the chain rattled, the lock clicked, a final, solid sound that sealed her back inside her world of safety and ignorance. Jay stood on the step for a moment, listening to the bolt slide home, then turned back to the constable. Note it down, he said, his voice rough again, the brief moment of empathy evaporating as the weight of the case settled back onto his shoulders. Date, time, description of the odor, cross-reference with weather reports for wind direction. Yes, sir, the constable scribbled in his notebook, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet street. Jay walked to the end of the path, his shoes leaving faint, damp prints on the concrete. He looked up at the window of number 23, the net curtain still drawn, the lace pattern distorting the interior into a blur of shadows and shapes. Behind that fabric, a man had lived, eaten, slept, and dismantled human beings, while the street outside remained politely, fatally silent. The architecture of the terrace encouraged this isolation, the high fences and small gardens creating cells of privacy that became tombs of secrecy. He moved to the next door, number 21. The same lace, the same shadow, the same reluctance waiting behind the wood. Jay raised his hand to knock, the motion feeling heavier this time, as if the air itself had thickened, resisting every attempt to breach the wall of silence. The rhythm of the investigation demanded progress, a forward momentum that pushed against the stagnant culture of the neighborhood. But here, on this quiet hill, the past refused to yield its bones without a fight. The knuckles connected with the wood. The sound echoed, flat and dull. Somewhere inside, a television droned, a muffled voice laughing at a joke no one in the street would ever hear. Jay waited, his hand hovering near the bell, ready to press, ready to disturb the peace one more time. The television inside droned on, a game show audience laughing at a prize nobody in this street could afford, the sound muffled by thick glass and thicker indifference. Jay let his hand drop, the knuckles stinging slightly from the impact, a sharp, mundane pain that grounded him while the rest of the world seemed to tilt on an axis of rot. He waited another 10 seconds, counting the rhythm of his own breath, watching the shadow behind the lace shift, not towards the door, but away. A retreat into the deep, safe center of the house, where the police could not follow without a warrant they did not yet possess. Nobody home, the constable said, scratching his nose with the back of a gloved hand. Or nobody willing. Same thing in this zip code, Jay muttered, turning his collar up against a wind that carried the damp chill of the North London clay, a coldness that seeped through the soles of his shoes and settled in the marrow. Mark it. We'll come back when the sun goes down and the curtains draw themselves. They moved along the pavement, the rhythm of their boots on the wet stone marking time in an investigation that felt less like a hunt and more like an excavation of a graveyard everyone had agreed to ignore. Number 19. A man answered this time, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that had seen better decades, his eyes narrow and suspicious as they scanned the warrant cards held out like shields. Police again, the man's voice was rough, scraped raw by tobacco and a lifetime of breathing in exhaust fumes from the Archway Road. I told the other fellow last week, I see nothing, I hear nothing. My telly's loud, that's my defense. We're not looking for defects in your insulation, Mr. Thorne, Albert Thorne, and I've got a right to quiet enjoyment of my property without the Met treating me like a suspect every time a drain gets blocked. Thorne leaned against the doorframe, blocking the view into his hallway, a territorial gesture that spoke of a man who valued his boundary lines more than the lives of strangers. It's a nuisance, is what it is. All these blue lights and men in suits traipsing over the flower beds. My wife's upset. She thinks someone's been murdered next door. Jay felt a flicker of something hot and dangerous in his chest, a desire to grab the man by his greasy lapels and shake the truth out of him, but he swallowed it down, letting it sit in his gut alongside the cold tea and the stale smoke of the last 48 hours. Someone has been murdered next door, Mr. Thorne, Jay said, his voice flat, stripping away the euphemisms that usually coated these conversations in a layer of polite bureaucracy. Several someones, and we are trying to find out how it happened while you were watching your telly and enjoying your quiet. Thorne blinked, the rag stopped moving, For a second, the mask of the aggrieved householder slipped, revealing a flicker of genuine fear, the kind that comes when the abstract horror of the news finally touches your own doorstep, smelling of wet earth and old blood. Well, Thorne stammered, taking a half-step back, his shoulder brushing the paintwork of his own door. I didn't mean, I just meant the noise, the coming and going. There was a van a few months back, white, no markings, took some bags out, heavy ones by the look of the suspension. Jay froze. The air around them seemed to thicken, the distant traffic fading into a dull roar as his entire focus narrowed to the grease-stained man in front of him. When, the word was a whip-crack, sharp and demanding. What date? October, maybe November, bonfire week. I remember because I was taking my own rubbish out, trying to get rid of the old garden furniture before the missus saw. Thorne gestured vaguely towards the rear of his property, where a pile of rotting wood sat under a tarp. He was struggling with them, two big black sacks dragged to the curb. He said it was just old carpets, damp from the rain. Said he was taking them to the tip. Did you see his face? Clearly as I see you, pale, clean-shaven, wearing a pullover grey with a diamond pattern, looked like a teacher or a clerk, not the sort you'd expect to be hauling dead weight to the curb at 10 o'clock at night. Thorne shivered, though the wind had not picked up, a reflexive recall from the memory now that it had been named. I offered to help. He said no, said he had it under control, said he didn't want to disturb the neighbors. Jay closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the scene. The quiet street, the net curtains drawn tight, the man in the grey pullover dragging the remains of a human being past the very people who claimed to see nothing. The banality of it was suffocating, the way evil had dressed itself in respectability and walked openly among them, asking for no help, receiving none, hindered only by the sheer, crushing weight of their own unwillingness to look. And you let him go, Jay said, not an accusation but a statement of fact, heavy with the weight of the collective failure of the entire street. He said it was carpets, Thorne defended himself, his voice rising, defensive and shrill. Why would I think otherwise? Who thinks that? You don't stop a man taking out his rubbish because you suspect he's carrying a corpse. That's mad. It's exactly what happened, Jay said, turning away before he said something that would end his career, something about complicity and silence and the blood on all their hands. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. We'll be in touch if we need a statement. He walked away quickly, his strides long and angry, the constable scrambling to keep up, notebook flapping against his leg. The information was gold, a solid, verifiable link to the disposal method, a timeline that matched the decomposition found in the drains, but it tasted like ash in his mouth. They had the who, the when, and the how, but the why remained locked behind those net curtains, behind the polite refusal to pry, the cultural agreement that what happened behind closed doors was nobody's business until the smell became too strong to ignore. At the corner of the terrace, Jay stopped, leaning against the brickwork of a garden wall that was covered in ivy, dark and choking. He lit a cigarette, the flame of the lighter trembling slightly in his hand, a betrayal of the exhaustion that was finally catching up to him. He inhaled deeply, the smoke burning his lungs, a sharp chemical taste that did nothing to mask the phantom scent of sweet decay that seemed to cling to the back of his throat. Sir, the constable stood a few feet away, unsure whether to speak or wait, his young face pale and drawn. Do we go back to the station? File the report on Thorne. Not yet, Jay said, exhaling a plume of grey smoke that mingled with the mist rising from the pavement. I want to walk the gardens, from the alley, see the fence line Mrs. Gable pointed out, see where the smoke went. It's getting dark, sir, and we don't have a search warrant for the rear access. We're not searching, we are looking. Jay pushed himself off the wall, dropping the cigarette and crushing it under his heel, grinding the ember into the wet concrete until it was nothing but a smear of ash. There's a difference, and right now, looking is all we've got. He led the way down the narrow alley that ran behind the terrace, a strip of darkness between the high fences where the bins were kept and the cats fought. The ground was slick with mud and fallen leaves, the air here heavier, trapped between the brick walls, holding the heat of the day and the memories of the autumn before. At the back of number 23, the fence was higher than the others, reinforced with extra panels of wood that had been painted a dark green, now peeling to reveal the grey timber beneath. Jay stopped before it, running a hand over the rough surface, feeling the texture of the wood, the way it had been nailed shut, sealed tight. There was a gap near the bottom, where the wood had rotted away, just large enough to slip a hand through or to push something small and dark out into the night. He crouched down, peering into the shadows of the garden beyond, where the grass was overgrown and the flower beds were bare, stripped of life, the soil disturbed and turned over in patches that looked too much like fresh grave. "Smell anything?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake the sleepers beneath the turf. The constable sniffed, wrinkling his nose. "Just damp earth, sir, and maybe old leaves." Jay closed his eyes, breathing in deeply, forcing his senses to strip away the present and reach back 6 months, to the bonfire night, to the sweet, cloying scent of burning hair and flesh that Mrs. Gable had mistaken for a fox trap. He could almost smell it now, a ghost in the nose, a memory of violence that the rain had washed away, but the earth had kept. "It's here," he said, opening his eyes, staring at the patch of turned soil with an intensity that made the constable step back. "It's all here, and we walked past it every day." He stood up, brushing the mud from his knees, his movements slow and stiff, the weight of the discovery settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. The alley was silent, save for the distant hum of the city, a sound that felt miles away, disconnected from the horror contained within these few square yards of North London soil. "Let's go," Jay said, turning back towards the main road, towards the lights and the cars and the people who would never know how close they had lived to the abyss. "We've got enough to bring him in, but God help us, we're going to need more than enough to make them listen." They walked out of the alley, leaving the dark garden behind, the gate clicking shut with a sound that was final, like the closing of a lid on a coffin, sealing the secrets of number 23 inside until the morning, until the warrants, until the earth itself was forced to give up its dead. The grey light of morning did nothing to improve the terrace. If anything, the dawn stripped away the protective shadow of the alley, leaving the brickwork exposed and raw, every crack in the mortar visible under the flat, ungenerous sky. Jay stood at the end of the street, the warrant folded square in his inside pocket, pressing against his ribs like a second heart, colder and heavier than the organ itself. He could feel the paper through the wool of his coat, a sharp edge digging into his sternum with every breath, a constant physical reminder of the authority he now carried and the violation he was about to commit. Beside him, the constable shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the wet pavement, a small, sharp sound that seemed too loud in the quiet residential stretch. Traffic was beginning to build on the main road, the distant rumble of buses and lorries starting their routes, a normal rhythm of a Tuesday that felt obscene given what waited behind the front door of number 23. "You're sure about the timing, sir?" The constable kept his voice low, eyes fixed on the house, on the closed door that looked no different than any other on the row. "We could wait for the uniformed backup," the divisional inspector said. "The divisional inspector is at his desk drinking tea," Jay interrupted, stepping off the curb without looking for cars, forcing the constable to hurry after him. "And by the time he finishes his cup, our man will be at work. Civil servant, routine, he likes routine, we catch him before he leaves." "It's just the neighbors." The constable gestured vaguely at the windows opposite, the net curtains drawn tight despite the hour. "They're watching, all of them." Jay glanced up. He saw them then, the subtle movements behind the lace, the shadows shifting as faces pressed close to the glass. It was a theater of curiosity, the entire street holding its breath, waiting to see what the police wanted with Mr. Nilsen from number 23, the quiet man who kept to himself. They had not watched when the boys went in. They had not watched when the smoke rose from the garden. But now, with the uniforms and the warrants and the official business of the state, the net curtains became eyes, wide and unblinking. "Let them watch," Jay said, his hands deep in his pockets, fingering the cold metal of his handcuffs. "Let them see what happens when we stop looking away." They walked up the path, the gravel crunching under their boots, a sound that seemed to announce their presence long before they reached the steps. The house sat silent, the windows dark, the paint on the doorframe peeling slightly at the bottom where the rain had gathered over the winter. It was a mundane setting for a charnel house, an ordinary brick box that held more death than a battlefield, and the dissonance of it made Jay's stomach turn, a slow, rolling nausea that had nothing to do with hunger. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the doorbell, a small white button set into the wood, clean and unmarked. There was no name on the letterbox, no indication of the life inside or the lack of it, just the number, painted in black, stark against the white wood. "Do we knock first?" The constable's hand hovered over his belt, near the truncheon, a reflex rather than a plan. "Or just enter?" "Knock," Jay said. "Give him the chance. If he runs, we take him. If he opens, we talk. And if he doesn't answer, then we use the warrant." Jay took the steps 2 at a time, the wood groaning under his weight, the sound echoing in the small porch. He could smell the damp wood, the old varnish, the scent of a home that was aired too rarely, where the air stagnated and turned thick. He raised his hand, the knuckles white against the dark wool of his sleeve, and hovered there for a second, the hesitation barely perceptible but heavy with the weight of what lay beyond. Behind him, he felt the gaze of the street, the collective attention of the net curtain society focused on his back, judging the procedure, the force, the intrusion. They wanted safety, but they did not want to know the cost of it. They wanted the monsters caught, but they did not want to see the face of the man who lived next door. Jay thought of Margaret Halloway, of the other mothers waiting for a call that would never come, of the coats hanging empty in the incident room, and the hesitation vanished. He knocked. 3 sharp raps, loud and final, the sound vibrating through the wood and into the frame, traveling into the silence of the house. They waited. The constable held his breath, shoulders hunched, eyes darting to the windows on either side. Jay kept his eyes on the door, on the letterbox slot, watching for the shadow of movement, the glint of an eye, the slide of a chain. Seconds stretched, elongated by the tension, the traffic on the main road fading into a dull roar that felt miles away. "Nothing." "Again," Jay said. He knocked harder this time, the sound cracking like a pistol shot in the quiet street. A light flickered on in the hallway behind the frosted glass, a pale yellow glow that revealed nothing but the presence of life. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, the sound of slippers on linoleum, a domestic rhythm that clashed violently with the purpose of their visit. The handle turned. Jay stepped back slightly, giving the door space to open, his hand moving to his pocket where the handcuffs waited, cold and ready. The constable shifted to the side, out of the direct line of fire, his hand now resting openly on his truncheon. The door opened inward, slow and smooth, revealing the hallway beyond, clean and tidy, smelling of polish and something else, something sweet and cloying that hung beneath the scent of lemon oil. A man stood there. He wore a suit, dark and pressed, a tie knotted tight at the collar, his hair combed back neatly. He looked tired, but calm, his eyes moving from Jay to the constable and back again, registering the uniforms, the warrants, the intent, without a flicker of surprise. "Can I help you?" The voice was flat, devoid of inflection, a civil servant asking for clarification on a form. "Dennis Nilsen?" Jay asked, though he knew the answer, though the name tasted like ash in his mouth. "Yes." Nilsen did not move to invite them in, nor did he attempt to close the door. He stood in the threshold, a barrier of flesh and bone, blocking the view of the hallway, protecting the secrets that waited in the rooms behind him. "What is this regarding?" Jay reached into his pocket, not for the handcuffs, but for the warrant, the paper crinkling loudly in the silence. He held it up, the official seal visible in the morning light, a stamp of authority that felt flimsy against the reality of the man standing before them. "We need to come in," Jay said, his voice steady, ignoring the question, bypassing the pretense of cooperation. "We have a warrant to search the premises, and you need to come with us." Nilsen looked at the warrant, then at Jay, his expression unreadable, a mask of polite compliance that hid whatever lay beneath. He stepped back, opening the door wider, an invitation that felt like a trap, a surrender that felt like a challenge. "Very well," Nilsen said, turning away from the door, walking back into the house, expecting them to follow. "You'd better come in then. It's cold out there." Jay exchanged a glance with the constable, a brief moment of shared unease, before stepping over the threshold, into the house, into the smell, into the dark heart of the hill where the bones waited. The door clicked shut behind them, cutting off the light, cutting off the street, leaving the net curtains to wonder what had happened, leaving the neighbors to whisper behind their lace, leaving the truth to be found in the drains. The smell hit them first, a physical weight that pressed against the back of the throat, thick and cloying like overripe fruit left to rot in a sealed jar. It was not the sharp, acidic sting of raw sewage, nor the earthy damp of a blocked pipe, but something sweeter, older, a scent that belonged to the interior of a body rather than the world outside. Jay stopped in the narrow hallway, his boots squeaking on the polished linoleum, the sound absurdly loud in the sudden quiet that fell over the house. Nilsen had moved past them, walking with a calm, measured gait towards the sitting room, his hands clasped behind his back, as if he were merely ushering guests in for tea. "Watch your step," Nilsen said, not turning around, his voice carrying that same flat, bureaucratic tone he had used at the door. "The carpet in the hall is loose. I've meant to fix it for weeks." Jay ignored the warning, his eyes scanning the walls, the framed pictures of landscapes and ships, the ordinary domesticity that felt like a costume worn by something monstrous. The constable followed close behind, hand still near his truncheon, breathing shallowly through his mouth to avoid the air. The sweetness intensified as they moved deeper, clinging to the clothes, settling in the hair, a perfume of decay that no amount of lemon oil or polish could mask. "Where is the bathroom?" Jay asked, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate for the magnitude of what they were about to uncover. Nilsen paused in the doorway of the sitting room, turning slowly to face them, his expression one of mild inconvenience. "Through here, down the passage. I expect that is where the trouble lies." He gestured with a pale, slender hand, a movement so casual it made Jay's stomach turn. The plumber said it was the main outlet, something solid blocking the flow. Jay nodded, a sharp, jerky motion, and pushed past the man, moving down the short corridor towards the rear of the house. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the wood groaning in protest, as if the house itself knew what was coming and wished to resist. The constable brushed against his arm, a silent offer of support, of shared burden, but Jay shook his head slightly, needing to be the first to see, the first to know the full extent of the horror. The bathroom door was ajar, painted a dull cream that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Jay pushed it open, the hinge whining softly, and stepped inside. The room was small, tiled in white that was now stained with grime in the corners, a single window high up letting in a sliver of grey sky. The bath sat against the far wall, filled with water that looked dark, almost black, the surface still and unmoving. But it was the floor that drew the eye, the space around the base of the toilet and the bath where the tiles had been lifted. A hole had been dug into the concrete, rough and jagged, exposing the pipes beneath. And from that hole, rising like a terrible offering, came the blockage. It was not just waste, it was flesh. Grey and pulpy, tangled with hair and fragments of bone, it clogged the pipe, a solid mass of human remains that had been forced down, shredded by the mechanics of the house, only to accumulate and refuse to pass. The sweet smell was overpowering here, a dense fog that filled the lungs, making the eyes water, the vision blur. Jay felt a wave of nausea roll through him, hot and violent, but he swallowed it down, locking his knees, forcing himself to look, to truly see what lay in the drain. "Good God," the constable whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them, a prayer or a curse, it was hard to tell. He stepped back, hitting the doorframe, his face draining of color, hand flying to cover his mouth. "What is that? Jesus, what is that?" Jay did not answer immediately. He couldn't. His mind was struggling to process the image, to reconcile the pile of organic matter with the concept of a person, of a life that had once walked and talked and breathed. He saw a finger, or what was left of one, the skin sloughed off, the bone white and stark against the grey sludge. He saw a patch of scalp, dark hair matted with filth. "It's them," Jay said finally, his voice rough, scraping against the silence of the room. "It's the missing boys, all of them." He turned to look at Nilsen, who had followed them down the hall and now stood in the doorway, observing the scene with the detached curiosity of a man watching a repairman fix a leak. There was no guilt in his eyes, no fear, only a mild interest in the complication his plumbing had caused. I told you it was a blockage, Nilsen said, shrugging slightly, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. I didn't know how to clear it. The tools I had weren't sufficient. It seemed difficult. Difficult, the constable's voice rose, cracking with anger, with disbelief. You've got bodies in your drain, you mad bastard, and you call it difficult. Nilsen looked at the constable, then at Jay, his brow furrowing slightly as if the reaction was unexpected, unreasonable. They were no longer of use to me, he explained, his tone conversational, as if discussing the disposal of old newspapers or broken furniture. And the bin men would not have taken them, not in that state. It seemed the most logical solution at the time. Jay felt a cold rage settle in his chest, hard and heavy as a stone. He wanted to strike the man, to smash that calm, polite face until it bled, until the mask slipped and the monster underneath screamed. But he was a detective, a servant of the law, and the law required procedure, evidence, a chain of custody that did not break under the weight of personal vengeance. Step away from the door, Jay ordered, his voice low, dangerous. Constable, secure him. Do not let him touch anything. Do not let him leave this room. The constable moved quickly, grabbing Nilsen's arm, pulling him back from the threshold, the handcuffs clicking shut around the thin wrists with a sound of finality. Nilsen did not resist, allowing himself to be led back, his eyes still fixed on the bath, on the dark water that hid so much. It's really quite simple, Nilsen murmured, more to himself than to them, as they dragged him out into the hall. You cut them up, you boil the flesh, you flush the rest. It works mostly, just not today. Jay stayed in the bathroom for a moment longer, alone with the dead. He looked down at the hole in the floor, at the grotesque tangle of humanity that had been reduced to waste, to an inconvenience in the plumbing of a quiet house in Muswell Hill. He thought of Margaret Halloway, of the vigil she kept, the hope she clung to like a lifeline, and he knew that in a few hours that hope would be extinguished, replaced by a truth too heavy to bear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook, his hand trembling slightly as he opened it to a fresh page. He needed to write it down, to record the time, the location, the nature of the discovery, before the memory of it could fade or be distorted by the mind's desire to forget. But the pen hovered over the paper, the ink refusing to flow, the words impossible to find for what lay before him. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window pane, a thin, mournful sound that echoed the silence of the house. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn blared, a reminder of the world continuing, indifferent to the horror contained within these four walls. Jay capped his pen, shoved the notebook back into his pocket, and turned away from the bath, from the bones, from the sweet, rotting air that would haunt him for the rest of his days. There was work to do. The phones would start ringing soon. The press would arrive. The neighbors would watch from behind their nets, and he would have to be the one to tell them, to explain how a man could live among them, eat with them, walk past them, while turning his neighbors into sludge in the sewer. He stepped out into the hall, closing the bathroom door softly behind him, shutting the smell in, keeping the dead company for a little longer while the living prepared for the storm. The hallway carpet felt damp beneath Jay's boots, a clammy sponge soaking up the weight of his step as he moved away from the sealed bathroom door. Nilsen sat on the bottom stair, legs crossed at the ankle, wrists cuffed behind the small of his back, where the metal bit into the pale skin of his civil servant's wrists. He watched Jay approach with the polite attention of a customer waiting for a table in a quiet restaurant, utterly devoid of the tremor that should have seized a man caught in the act of butchery. You'll need to call the divisional surgeon, Nilsen offered, his voice level, helpful even, and perhaps a van. The quantity is greater than I anticipated when the water stopped moving. Jay ignored the suggestion, the words sliding off him like rain off oilskin, and instead focused on the constable who stood guard by the front window, peering through the gap in the net curtain. The young officer flinched when Jay touched his shoulder, spinning around with a hand half raised to his belt before recognition dulling the panic in his eyes. Get the car, Jay said. Bring it to the door. And tell control we need the heavy goods team, not the usual wagon. This isn't a pickup. Sir, the constable swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat tight with the taste of bile he couldn't quite suppress. Heavy goods for him. For what's in the pipes, Jay corrected, his gaze drifting past the boy to the staircase where Nilsen waited, patient as a saint in a stained glass window. We're going to need diggers, shovels, everything, just get the car round. The constable nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion, and hurried towards the front door, the floorboards groaning under his haste. Jay turned back to the suspect, studying the face that had smiled at neighbors, bought groceries, and paid rates while dissolving human beings into the municipal drainage system. There was no madness there, no wild hair or foaming mouth, only a terrifying ordinariness that made the air in the hall feel thinner, harder to draw into lungs that suddenly demanded more oxygen. "Did you know their names?" Jay asked, the question slipping out before he could weigh its necessity, a crack in the professional armor. Nilsen tilted his head, considering the query with genuine effort, as if the information were filed away in a cabinet somewhere and required retrieval. "Some of them," he replied eventually. "Names are less important than the presence. They were lonely. I was lonely. It was an arrangement that suited us both until the end came naturally." "Naturally," Jay repeated, the word tasting of ash. "Well, inevitably," Nilsen corrected, a faint frown creasing his forehead. "One does not plan for death, Detective Chief Inspector. One merely deals with the aftermath. The plumbing was the only issue I had not fully resolved. I assumed the water pressure would be sufficient." Footsteps hammered on the pavement outside, the heavy thud of boots running, followed by the slam of a car door and the cough of an engine starting. The blue light of the police torch began to sweep across the ceiling of the hallway, casting long, dancing shadows that made the wallpaper pattern seem to writhe. Jay walked to the front door and pushed it open, the cold February air rushing in to collide with the sweet, thick heat of the house, a clash of temperatures that made him shiver despite his coat. The constable was reversing the Ford Granada up the path, tires crunching on the gravel, headlights cutting through the gloom to illuminate the peeling paint of the front porch. Behind them, in the houses across the street, lights were flickering on, yellow squares appearing in the darkness as neighbors drawn by the commotion peeled back their own nets to watch the spectacle. A woman in a dressing gown stood at her window, arms crossed against the chill, her face a pale moon in the glass, watching the police car with a hunger that suggested she sensed something far worse than a blocked drain. "Keep them back," Jay ordered as the constable killed the engine. "No one comes near the house, not the press, not the gawkers. If anyone steps on the grass, arrest them." "It's just Mrs. Gable from number 25, the constable said, gesturing vaguely towards the opposing terrace. "She's been out there since the plumber left last week, said the smell was making her cat sick." Jay looked across the street. Mrs. Gable stood rigid in her window, her silhouette sharp against the interior light, a sentinel guarding the street from a horror she could smell but not see. She had refused to speak to them during the initial canvass, claiming ignorance of the tenants, of the comings and goings, of the young men who had vanished into the fog of North London. Now she watched, unblinking, as the truth began to leak out of the ground beneath her feet. "Let her watch," Jay said, turning his back on the window, on the judging eyes of the street. "She'll have plenty to see before the night is done." He stepped back inside, closing the door against the cold, against the neighbors, against the world that continued to spin indifferent to the grave being uncovered in its midst. The hallway felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the invisible dust of bone and flesh that had settled into the wallpaper, the carpet, the very wood of the staircase. Nilsen had not moved, still sitting on the bottom step, his head bowed slightly as if in prayer or perhaps just boredom, waiting for the next instruction in this bureaucratic procedure he seemed to understand better than they did. "They'll want a statement," Jay said, more to the empty air than to the man on the stairs. "They'll want to know how many, how long." "I can draw you a map," Nilsen offered, looking up, his eyes bright with a sudden, eager industry. "The garden, the shed, the drains, it's all quite systematic. I kept records, initially, before I realized the paperwork was becoming a burden." Jay felt a surge of nausea, violent and sudden, forcing him to grip the newel post to steady himself. The wood was rough under his palm, splintered and old, a tangible anchor in a room that felt like it was tilting on its axis. He thought of the files in his office, the thin folders with the photographs of smiling boys, The mothers who called every week asking if there was news, if there was a sighting, a hope. He thought of Margaret Halloway's voice on the telephone, trembling with a desperation he had dismissed as the grief of a woman unable to let go. "Save it for the station," Jay managed, his voice tight, strangled. "Don't speak to anyone else. Do you understand? Not the officers, not the surgeons. You wait for me." "As you wish," Nilsen said, settling back against the banister, closing his eyes for a moment as if tired from the exertion of conversation. "It is late, after all, and there is much work to be done in the morning." The front door opened again, admitting a gust of wind and the sound of more vehicles arriving, the heavy diesel rumble of the support van mixing with the sharp chatter of radios. Officers spilled into the hall, bringing with them the smell of wet wool, tobacco, and the crisp, clean scent of the night outside, a stark contrast to the stagnant decay that permeated the house. They looked at Jay, waiting for orders, for direction, for someone to tell them that this was a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding that could be cleaned up and filed away before breakfast. Jay straightened his jacket, pulling his shoulders back, forcing the mask of command back into place over the horror that threatened to crack his face open. He looked at the bathroom door, closed and silent now, hiding the evidence of a crime so vast it threatened to swallow the entire investigation, the entire force, the entire city. "Secure the garden," he ordered, his voice ringing clear in the sudden hush of the hallway. "Cordon off the rear, and get the forensic team in here, now, before the tide turns." He did not explain what tide he meant, the one in the Thames or the one of blood that had risen through the pipes to flood their world, but the officers moved anyway, driven by the tone of his voice, by the grim set of his jaw, by the unspoken knowledge that the night had just changed shape forever. Nilsen opened his eyes, watching them scurry with that same mild interest, as if he were observing ants rebuilding a hill after a boot had crushed it, knowing full well that the ground beneath them was rotten to the core. The bathroom door yielded to a shove that felt less like police work and more like an intrusion into a tomb sealed by grease and time. Inside, the air hung heavy, a physical weight pressing against the sinuses, tasting of wet earth and something older, sweeter, like fruit left to rot in the sun before being buried under wet wool. Jay stepped over the threshold, his boots leaving muddy prints on the linoleum that curled at the edges, revealing the black damp beneath. The room was small, claustrophobic, dominated by the bathtub, which sat like a white porcelain altar in the corner, its chrome taps gleaming under the harsh glare of the single bulb swinging gently from the ceiling. "Christ," whispered Constable Miller, standing just behind Jay, his hand clamped over his nose and mouth as if the gesture could filter out the smell. "It's coming from the plug hole." Jay did not answer. He moved closer, drawn by a terrible magnetism he could not resist, his eyes fixed on the drain where the water had receded to leave a ring of grey sludge clinging to the enamel. Something blocked the U-bend, a mass so dense it had forced the wastewater to back up, spilling over the rim hours ago to stain the bath mat with a dark, oily tide. It was not hair, not soap scum, not the usual accumulation of domestic life that clogged the pipes of North London. It looked like meat, raw and pallid, stripped of skin and identity, packed tight against the iron curves of the plumbing until the flow stopped entirely. "Get the torch," Jay said, his voice flat, devoid of the tremor shaking his hands. "Shine it down there, don't touch it." Miller fumbled in his pocket, producing a heavy aluminium torch that cast a sharp, white beam into the darkness of the drain. The light caught the texture of the obstruction, illuminating strands of fiber that might have been muscle, chunks of pale fat that glistened with a sickly sheen, and the unmistakable, jagged curve of a bone fragment no larger than a fingernail. The smell intensified, rising to meet them, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of the throat and refused to be swallowed, demanding recognition. "It's blocked solid," Miller muttered, stepping back until his heels hit the doorframe. Looks like someone tried to flush a leg." "Not a leg," Jay corrected, the words tasting of ash. "Parts, many parts." He reached for the telephone on the small shelf beside the sink, the plastic cold and grimy under his fingers. His dialing was slow, deliberate, each click of the rotary wheel sounding like a gunshot in the confined space. He needed the divisional surgeon, needed the heavy equipment from the fire brigade, needed to turn this house inside out before the morning light brought the neighbors swarming with their questions and their cameras. But mostly, he needed to hear a voice that belonged to the world outside, a voice that did not know about the meat in the pipes or the man sitting calmly on the stairs. "Get me Dr. Price," he told the operator, his eyes never leaving the bath. "Tell him to bring a saw and tell him to bring a bag, a large one." Miller turned away, retching softly into his handkerchief, his shoulders heaving with the violence of his reaction. The young constable had joined the force expecting traffic accidents and drunk and disorderlies, not this excavation of human refuse from the sewage system of a quiet residential street. Jay watched him, feeling a distant pity for the boy's shattered innocence, knowing that once you saw what lay in the drain, you could never quite scrub the image from your mind, no matter how many times you washed your hands or changed your uniform. "Sir," Miller gasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "The neighbors, Mrs. Gable, she's shouting something." Jay ignored him, listening to the crackle of the line as the operator connected the call. The ringing tone seemed to stretch out, echoing in the tiled room, a mechanical pulse counting down the seconds until the official machinery of the state arrived to catalogue the horror. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the single pane of glass in the window, carrying with it the distant wail of a siren approaching from the main road, a sound that usually brought comfort but now felt like a dirge. "Price speaking," came the voice, thick with sleep and irritation. "Jay, do you know what time it is?" 23 Melrose Avenue, Jay said, his gaze fixed on the grey mass in the tub. "Bring the van, bring the team, and Peter, do not eat breakfast before you come." There was a pause on the other end, a silence long enough for Jay to hear the doctor's breathing change, to sense the sudden alertness cutting through the fog of sleep. "What have you found, Peter? Is it a body?" "Worse," Jay replied, lowering the receiver slightly so Miller could not hear the full extent of the confession. "It's the plumbing. The whole house is full of them." He hung up before Price could ask for clarification, before the questions could begin that would force him to articulate the unthinkable. The receiver clicked into its cradle, the sound final and absolute. In the hallway, the footsteps of more officers echoed, heavy and urgent, as the cordon tightened around the property, sealing it off from the rest of Muswell Hill. They were building a wall of blue uniforms around the rot, trying to contain the stench before it seeped out into the street, before it contaminated the morning commute of the thousands who would pass by unaware that they were walking over a graveyard. Jay turned from the sink, his reflection in the mirror above it pale and haggard, eyes sunken as if he had not slept in weeks. He looked at Miller, who was still leaning against the doorframe, trying to regain his composure, trying to pretend he was still a policeman and not a witness to an abattoir. "Go downstairs," Jay ordered, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that brooked no argument. "Tell Nilsen he is under arrest for murder, all of them, every single one." "And then," Miller asked, his voice trembling. "And then we start digging," Jay said, stepping past him into the hallway, where the air was only slightly less toxic, where the man on the stairs waited with his maps and his records, ready to guide them through the labyrinth of his own making. "Because I think we're only going to find the tip of it." The floorboards creaked under his weight as he descended, each step taking him closer to the killer, closer to the source of the blockage that had brought them all to this terrible dawn. The house seemed to hold its breath, the walls listening, the net curtains in the front room still twitching as Mrs. Gable watched from across the street, her face pressed against the glass, waiting for the police to carry out the evidence of what had been hiding in plain sight all along. Jay reached the bottom of the stairs and looked at Nilsen, who was now standing, smoothing down his trousers, ready to assist, ready to explain, ready to treat the recovery of human remains as just another item on the day's agenda. "Come with me," Jay said, opening the front door to let in the cold, clean air of the night, a stark contrast to the hell inside. "You can show us where the rest of them are." Nilsen nodded, a small, polite smile touching his lips, and stepped out onto the pavement, into the light of the halogen lamps, into the beginning of the end. Behind them, the bathroom door stood open, the bath waiting, the drain full, the silence of the house broken only by the sound of the approaching vans and the low, steady hum of the city continuing its indifferent spin around the hill of bones. The cold air outside hit Jay's face like a wet cloth, stripping away the stale heat of the hallway and the cloying sweetness that had begun to coat the back of his throat. He stepped onto the pavement, the gravel crunching under his shoes, and pulled his coat tighter against the damp draft rolling off the hill. Nilsen stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back, as if waiting for a bus rather than standing under arrest for multiple counts of murder, his breath pluming in the halogen glare set up by the uniformed constables. The light was harsh, bleaching the color from the brickwork and casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the front garden like grasping fingers. "Bit brisk out here," Nilsen said, his voice level, devoid of the tremor that had shaken Miller inside. "Should have brought a scarf." Jay did not answer. He watched the house, number 23, its windows' dark eyes staring back at the street, the net curtains in the front room still twitching where Mrs. Gable had been watching. She was there still, he knew, pressed against the lace, witnessing the police escorting a neighbor away in the early hours of the morning without understanding why the air itself seemed to reekle from the doorway. A Ford Transit van pulled up to the curb, engine idling rough in the cold, its headlights cutting through the fog to illuminate the scene with a stark, clinical brightness. Price stepped out, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his collar turned up against the wind, looking at Jay with a question that he did not dare ask aloud. "Keep him here," Jay said, nodding towards Nilsen, who was now examining his own shoes with mild interest. "I want the garden secured before we move him anywhere else." "The garden?" Price asked, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the pavement. "You think there's more out here?" "I think the bath wasn't the start," Jay replied, turning his back on the house to face the rear, where a wooden fence separated the property from the alleyway beyond. "And I think he's been burning things for a long time." The smell hit them then, not the concentrated rot of the bathroom, but a thinner, acrid scent that drifted on the wind, smelling of charred wood and something heavier, something organic that had been cooked until it ceased to be recognizable. It was the smell of a bonfire night long past, lingering in the soil, embedded in the roots of the overgrown shrubs that lined the path to the back gate. Jay walked towards it, his torch beam cutting a cone of light through the darkness, illuminating the damp grass and the scattered debris of a normal life gone wrong. A rusted barbecue stood near the fence, its grate clean, too clean for a device left out in the London winter, scrubbed perhaps to remove evidence that the rain had failed to wash away. "Miller," Jay called out, not turning around, knowing the constable would be hovering near the door, reluctant to re-enter the house but unwilling to be left alone with his thoughts. "Get a spade, get two." "Sir," Miller's voice came from the shadows, shaky, uncertain. "Now, in the dark." "Now," Jay said, stopping beside a patch of earth that looked disturbed, the soil darker than the surrounding grass, flattened as if something heavy had been placed there and then removed. "Before the sun comes up and the press starts gathering on the main road. I want this ground turned over before the city wakes up." He could feel the weight of the neighborhood on his back, the sense of hundreds of people sleeping in their beds just yards away, protected by the ignorance that allowed them to lock their doors and trust that the horror was always somewhere else. Here, in this quiet terrace of respectable civil servants and retired couples, the earth was contaminated, and he was the one tasked with digging it up. Nilsen shifted his weight on the pavement, the sound of his shoes scraping against the stone echoing in the quiet street, a mundane noise that clashed violently with the task at hand. "It's easier in the light," Nilsen offered, speaking to Jay's back, offering advice on the excavation of his own crimes as if discussing the best time to plant bulbs. "The shadows play tricks. You might miss something." "I won't miss anything," Jay said, turning to face him, the torch beam catching the killer's glasses, reflecting the light back so that his eyes were hidden behind two white discs. "You made sure of that." Miller emerged from the side of the house, carrying two spades, the metal heads dull and scratched from years of service in a police store cupboard. He handed one to Jay, keeping the other for himself, his hands gripping the wooden handle too tightly, knuckles white against the varnish. The ground was hard, frozen by the February frost, resisting the first thrust of the spade when Jay drove it into the turf near the barbecue. The sound of metal hitting earth was dull, a thud that seemed to vibrate up through the handle and into his arms, a physical rejection of the intrusion. "Careful," Nilsen said softly, watching them work, his tone conversational, detached. "There are pipes back there, water, gas. I wouldn't want to cause an explosion." Jay paused, leaning on the spade, breathing hard as the cold air filled his lungs, scrubbing out the sweetness of the house, but replacing it with the smell of wet soil and decay. He looked at the man standing under arrest, the man who had invited them in for tea, who had shown them the bath, who was now offering safety advice regarding the disposal of human remains. There was no madness in his face, no visible distortion that would mark him as a monster to the neighbors watching through their net curtains. He was just a man in a suit, standing on the pavement, waiting for the police to finish their work so he could go to bed. "Dig," Jay said to Miller, ignoring the advice, driving the spade in again, deeper this time, feeling the resistance of the roots giving way. "We'll find the pipes when we hit them." The soil turned over revealed nothing at first, just dark, damp earth, clods of grass overturned to show their pale undersides. But the smell grew stronger, rising from the ground as if the earth itself was exhaling the secrets it had been forced to keep. Jay straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers, leaving streaks of mud on the wool, not caring about the stain or the ruin of the fabric. He looked at the house, then at the garden, then at the street beyond, where the first hint of grey was beginning to lighten the sky above the rooftops. Morning was coming, bringing with it the noise of the city, the lorries starting their routes, the commuters queuing for buses, all of them unaware that they were passing a grave. "Check the shed," Jay said, nodding towards the wooden structure at the bottom of the garden, its door slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. "And bring a camera. We need to document every inch before we touch it." Miller nodded, moving towards the shed, his steps quicker now, driven by the need to be away from the hole they were digging in the lawn. Jay remained where he was, standing over the disturbed earth, listening to the sound of the wind in the branches of the trees that overhung the fence. It was a quiet sound, rustling leaves that had long since fallen, a natural rhythm that continued regardless of the unnatural act committed beneath them. He thought of the bath upstairs, the blockage, the water that had refused to drain, and realized that this garden was the same, a system clogged with things that should have been allowed to pass. Nilsen cleared his throat, a polite, restraining sound. "Detective Jay, I'm getting rather cold. Might we proceed?" Jay looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the impatience behind the politeness, the desire to have the process over and done with so the paperwork could begin. He drove the spade into the ground one last time, leaving it standing upright in the turf, a marker in the dark soil. "Not yet," Jay said, turning away from him, towards the shed, towards the next layer of the horror. "We're just getting started." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the city, of exhaust and damp concrete, masking the smell of the garden for a moment before it returned, stronger than before, insisting on being noticed. Jay walked towards the shed, his torch beam dancing over the wood, looking for the handle, looking for the lock, looking for the next place where the dead were waiting to be found. Behind him, the van engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in the street other than the wind and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man under arrest. The shed door groaned on a single rusted hinge, a high, complaining note that sliced through the low murmur of the city waking up. Jay pushed it open with the toe of his shoe, unwilling to touch the wood with his bare hands, though the mud already caked his trousers suggested the distinction was moot. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of creosote, damp compost, and something older, sweeter, that clung to the back of the throat like syrup. The torch beam cut a cone of dust-moted light through the gloom, illuminating rows of gardening tools hanging in neat, military precision. Trowels, rakes, shears, all clean, all oiled, all waiting for a master who treated his implements with more care than his guests. "Jesus," Miller whispered, the word barely escaping before he clamped a hand over his mouth, as if the name itself might offend the occupants of the small wooden room. He stood by a large black plastic sack, the kind used for council refuse, which sat open on the concrete floor. It was not tied. The top flaps were folded back with a fastidiousness that made Jay's stomach turn revealing the contents to the cold air. There was no attempt at concealment here, no hurried burial in the dark earth outside. This was storage, inventory. A head rested against the side of the bag, the skin grey and waxy, pulled tight over the bone in a grimace that looked almost like surprise. The eyes were open, staring at the corrugated iron roof, seeing nothing, while the mouth hung slack, a dark cave in the pale face. "Get the camera," Jay said, his voice flat, stripped of any inflection that might betray the revolt churning in his gut. "Don't touch anything, not yet." Miller fumbled with the camera case, his fingers thick and clumsy, the leather strap tangling around his wrist as he fought to free the device. The click of the shutter sounded absurdly loud in the confined space, a sharp, mechanical snap that seemed to violate the silence of the dead man. Flashbulbs popped, casting brief, harsh shadows that danced and vanished, leaving the room darker than before, the afterimage burning in Jay's vision. One shot, two, three. The film advanced with a gritty whir, each frame capturing another angle of the indignity, another proof of the life extinguished and stacked like firewood in a garden shed. "He kept them warm," Miller said, his voice trembling, the observation slipping out before he could check it. "Look, there's a heater behind the sacks." Jay followed the beam of his torch to the corner. A small electric fire sat on a brick, the element cold now, but the air around it held a residual warmth, a microclimate created for the preservation of flesh. Next to it stood a kettle, a tin of tea, a mug with a lipstick stain on the rim, domestic items arranged with a chilling normalcy beside the open sack of human remains. It was the banality of it that struck hardest, the way the horror had been folded into the routine of a Sunday gardener, accepted as part of the landscape, just another task to be completed before supper. "Bag him," Jay ordered, turning his back on the scene, needing to see the sky, the grey dawn, anything that wasn't this wooden box of secrets. "Seal the shed. No one in, no one out. I want forensics here within the hour." He stepped out into the garden, the cold air hitting his face like a physical blow, cleansing the palate, scrubbing the sweet rot from his senses. Nilsen was still standing where they had left him, hands clasped behind his back, shifting his weight from one foot to the other to keep the circulation moving. He looked towards the shed as Jay emerged, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if waiting for a verdict on a planning application rather than the discovery of a corpse in his tool storage. "Ah," Nilsen said, nodding slowly. "I wondered if you'd find that one. He was rather difficult to dispose of in the garden. The soil is so clay-heavy this time of year, holds the water, makes digging a nightmare." Jay walked up to him, stopping inches away, close enough to see the pores in the man's nose, the flecks of grey in his irises, the absolute lack of shame in his posture. The urge to strike him, to drive a fist into that calm, composed face, rose up hot and violent, a primal reaction to the violation of everything decent. He clenched his fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms, using the pain to anchor himself, to keep the officer in control and the man beneath from breaking loose. "How many?" Jay asked, the question hanging in the air, heavy and dangerous. "In the shed, in the garden, in the house, tell me." Nilsen tilted his head, considering the question with the deliberation of a man calculating a tax return. "It's hard to say exactly. One loses count after a while. They all blend together, you see. Just faces, just bodies. It becomes administrative." "Administrative," Jay repeated, the word tasting like ash. "You treat murder as administration." "It's not murder in the way you mean it," Nilsen corrected gently, as if explaining a nuance of protocol to a new recruit. "They were already gone. I just tidied up, saved them from the indignity of the worm, gave them a place to rest. Is that so wrong?" Miller emerged from the shed, face pale, carrying the camera like a burden he couldn't wait to set down. He shook his head slightly at Jay, a silent confirmation that the inventory inside was worse than imagined, that the black sacks were not unique. The wind picked up again, rattling the loose slats of the shed door, a dry, rattling sound like bones knocking together. "Get him in the van," Jay said, turning away, unable to look at the man any longer without doing something that would end his career. "Cover his head. I don't want him seeing anything else. I don't want him talking to anyone." "Where are we taking him?" Miller asked, his hand on Nilsen's arm, guiding him towards the police vehicle. Muswell Hill Station or straight to the yard? Anywhere but here, Jay said, watching them walk across the lawn, the prisoner stepping carefully over the freshly turned earth, avoiding the mud on his polished shoes. Just get him out of my sight. He stood alone in the garden as the van door slammed shut, the sound final, like a coffin lid closing. The engine roared to life, vibrating through the soles of his boots, and then the vehicle pulled away, tires crunching on the gravel, disappearing down the street towards the main road. The silence rushed back in to fill the void, heavier now, loaded with the weight of the dead men in the shed and the ones still missing, the ones perhaps still waiting in the drains, in the walls, in the dark spaces of this quiet, respectable house. Jay looked at the spade still standing in the turf, the handle swaying slightly in the breeze. He walked over to it, gripped the wood, and drove it into the ground again, deeper this time, needing to feel the resistance, needing to know how far down the rot went. The metal struck something hard, a root or a stone, and the shock jarred his arms, but he did not stop. He dug, turning over the earth, exposing the pale undersides of the grass, searching for the next layer of the truth, knowing that the blockage in the drain was only the beginning, the first symptom of a disease that had spread through the very foundations of the street. Somewhere in the distance, a milk lorry clattered down the hill, the bottles rattling in their crates, a sound of ordinary life continuing despite the horror unearthed in the garden. Jay paused, leaning on the spade, listening to the rhythm of it, the mundane noise of a city waking up, unaware that the ground beneath it was soft with the dead. He took a breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and drove the spade in again. The spade bit into the clay, a dull thud that traveled up the wooden handle and settled as a numb ache in Jay's wrists. He leveraged the turf back, exposing a ribbon of wet, dark earth that smelled of iron and something older, something that had no business sleeping this close to a kitchen window. It was not the smell of a grave, for graves were dignified by distance and ritual, but the scent of a compost heap gone wrong, a fermentation of things that should have been buried deep or burned clean. "Stop digging, sir." Miller stood at the garden gate, the metal latch still warm from his grip, his face a mask of exhausted authority that did not quite reach his eyes. He had returned without the van, leaving Nilsen to the uniformed constables who would drive the long, slow route to Muswell Hill, ensuring the prisoner had time to compose his thoughts, to refine his administrative language before the tape recorders began their endless spin. "There's more," Jay said, not turning, driving the blade down again, splitting a clump of frozen soil that scattered like shrapnel across the lawn. If he lost count, Miller, then the ground knows. The ground always keeps the receipt. "The forensics team is 20 minutes out," Miller replied, stepping onto the grass, his shoes sinking slightly into the churned mud, leaving prints that would need to be photographed, catalogued, measured against the chaos Jay was creating. "They need the site pristine. You're contaminating the stratigraphy. You're making their job impossible." Jay rested his forehead against the cool wood of the spade handle, the rough grain biting into his skin, a sharp, grounding pain that forced the fog in his head to recede just enough to let the logic filter through. He was not a gravedigger. He was a detective, and his tool was not steel but procedure, the slow, grinding machinery of the law that required evidence to be untouched, unbroken, preserved in the amber of protocol, so that a jury of 12 strangers could believe in the horror without having to smell it. "Pristine," Jay repeated, the word feeling foreign in his mouth, inadequate to describe a garden that had been used as a larder for the dead. "There is nothing pristine about this place, Miller. It's a slaughterhouse with a net curtain." He pulled the spade from the earth, the suction of the clay making a wet, sucking sound, like a boot being pulled from a riverbed, and tossed it onto the pile of excavated turf. The noise was final, a dismissal of his own impulse, a surrender to the way things had to be done if they were to be done at all. He wiped his hands on his trousers, smearing the dark soil across the grey wool, a stain that would not wash out, a mark of the morning that would cling to him long after the uniforms had hosed down the pavement, and the neighbors had drawn their curtains tight against the memory of the police cars idling in the street. Bag the tools, Jay said, his voice flat, stripped of the anger that had fueled the digging, leaving only the weary residue of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. Every spoon, every fork, every gardening implement. If he used it to cut them, I want it in evidence. If he used it to stir his tea, I want that too. Miller nodded, pulling a notebook from his pocket, the pages fluttering in the breeze as he scribbled the instructions, the scratch of the pen a small human sound against the vast, silent horror of the house behind them. And the drain, the plumber said the blockage was solid, organic. He refused to go back in. Get a team with breathing apparatus, Jay ordered, turning towards the house, towards the small, frosted window of the bathroom where the pipe descended into the dark belly of the building. Cut the floorboards, cut the concrete. I don't care what it takes. If there are pieces of them down there, we bring them up. We do not leave them in the dark. It'll take days, sir, Miller said, looking up from his book, his eyes shadowed by the lack of sleep that plagued them all, the shared exhaustion of a city trying to digest a truth too large for its stomach. The neighbors will ask questions. The press will smell it before we even break the surface. Let them ask, Jay said, walking towards the back door, the handle cold under his palm, the wood swollen with damp. Let them smell it. Maybe then they'll understand why we're here. Maybe then they'll stop looking at their feet when we ask if they saw anything unusual. He pushed the door open, the hinges complaining with a high-pitched squeal that echoed through the silent hallway, a sound that seemed to wake the house, to stir the dust motes dancing in the dim light of the corridor. The air inside was stale, trapped, heavy with the scent of boiled cabbage and something sweeter, cloying, that coated the back of the throat like syrup. It was the smell of a home that had been closed up too long, of a life lived in isolation, where the boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred until they were indistinguishable. Jay walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cold through his socks, the silence so absolute it felt like pressure against his eardrums. On the table, a cup of tea sat untouched, a thick grey skin forming on the surface, a perfect circle of stagnation that mirrored the stillness of the room. Beside it, a plate with a crust of toast, bitten once, then abandoned, the bite mark a small human detail that made the horror feel personal, intimate, a violation of the simple act of breakfast. He ate here, Jay said, more to himself than to Miller, who hovered in the doorway, reluctant to cross the threshold into the inner sanctum of the killer's domesticity. He ate while they were in the shed, while they were in the drain. He ate while he planned the next one. It's a sickness, sir, Miller offered, his voice low, respectful of the sanctity of the scene, afraid to disturb the dust that settled on the surfaces like snow. Something broken in the head. You can't reason with it. No, Jay agreed, reaching out to touch the rim of the teacup, the ceramic cold, the skin on the tea dry and flaking under his fingertip. But we can count them, we can name them, and we can make sure that when he stands in that court, he has to look at every single one of them. He turned away from the table, the image of the cold tea burning itself into his memory, a symbol of the time that had been stolen, the mornings that would never come for the young men who had walked through this door and never walked out. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved towards the hallway, towards the stairs that led to the rooms where the beds were made with military precision, where the sheets were changed regularly, where the illusion of normalcy had been maintained with such terrifying diligence. Get the search team in, Jay said, his hand on the banister, the wood polished smooth by years of use, by the touch of a man who had killed with one hand and cleaned with the other. Start with the bathroom, then the attic, then the rooms, leave nothing unturned. If there's a bone in the walls, I want it found. Miller nodded again, pulling his radio from his belt, the static crackling briefly before he began to speak, his voice professional, detached, masking the revulsion that must have been churning in his gut. Jay listened to the codes, the call signs, the routine language of the police force that served as a shield against the chaos, a way to impose order on the disorder, to make the unthinkable manageable through the use of acronyms and procedures. He climbed the first step, the wood groaning under his weight, and paused, looking back at the kitchen, at the cold tea, the half-eaten toast, the quiet horror of a Sunday morning in Muswell Hill. The sun was higher now, casting a pale, watery light through the net curtains, illuminating the dust motes, the scratches on the table, the ordinary details of a life that had hidden a monstrous secret. "Sir," Miller called from the hallway, his voice echoing slightly in the empty house. "The forensics van is here. They're asking for directions to the rear access." Jay took a breath, the air thick with the smell of the past, of the dead men who waited in the dark, and nodded to himself, a silent promise that he would not look away, that he would carry the weight of it all until the very end. "Show them in," he said, his voice steady, ready for the long, slow work of excavation, of recovery, of bringing the light into the places where it had been forbidden for so long. "And tell them to bring extra bags. We're going to need them." The stairwell air tasted of beeswax and old tobacco, a dry particulate that settled on the tongue and refused to be swallowed. Jay placed his foot on the second tread, testing the wood before committing his full weight, listening for the specific groan that might betray a hollow space beneath the runner. Nothing. The house held its breath, or perhaps it had simply forgotten how to exhale. "Careful with the banister," Miller said from below, his voice stripped of the casual tone he used in the canteen, reduced now to a functional rasp. "It's loose near the newel post. Landlord mentioned it in the statement, said Nilsen meant to fix it, but never got round to the job." "Men who dismantle bodies find time for everything else," Jay muttered, gripping the polished wood higher up, away from the wobble, and pulling himself into the landing. The corridor upstairs was narrower than the one below, the walls pressing in with a claustrophobic intimacy that made the shoulders ache just by walking through. Two doors faced him, both closed, both painted the same dull magnolia that seemed to absorb the weak February light rather than reflect it. To the left, a bathroom door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of white porcelain visible through the gap, gleaming with a cleanliness that felt aggressive in this context. To the right, the bedroom. Jay knew which room held the bed with the military corners. The sheets changed with a frequency that suggested a ritual rather than mere hygiene. He could smell it now, distinct from the cabbage downstairs, a scent that had no place in a residential terrace in Muswell Hill. It was sweet, cloying, the odor of fruit left too long in a hot cupboard, overlaid with the sharp, chemical tang of disinfectant used in excessive quantities. "Door on the right," Jay said, not turning to check if Miller had followed him up. "That's where he kept them, before the fire, before the drain." Miller appeared at his shoulder, a large man who suddenly looked small in the narrow hall, his face pale under the fluorescent strip light that flickered with a dying buzz. "Forensics are setting up in the garden, sir. They want to know if they should start digging the flower beds or wait for the specialist team from Hendon." "Wait," Jay said, pushing the bedroom door open with the toe of his shoe, unwilling to touch the handle with his bare skin. "Nothing moves until we see what's behind the wallpaper. Nothing." The room was exactly as the files had described, yet the reality of it struck with a physical force that made the knees buckle for a fraction of a second. It was tidy, impossibly, offensively tidy. The bed was made, the counterpane smoothed flat, a single pillow propped at the head as if awaiting a sleeper who would never arrive. A small television sat on a cabinet in the corner, its screen dark, reflecting the grey window and the two men standing in the doorway. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood on the carpet, no chaos of a violent end. The violence had been hidden, processed, removed with the efficiency of a civil servant filing a report. Jay stepped inside, the floorboards silent under his weight, and walked to the window. The net curtains were drawn, filtering the outside world into a soft, indistinct blur, turning the street below into a watercolor painting of normalcy where people walked their dogs and drove to work, unaware of the geometry of death arranged in the room behind the lace. "He watched them from here," Jay said, tracing the edge of the curtain with a gloved finger, feeling the synthetic texture, the cheapness of the material against the wool. "Watched the neighbors, watched the police cars go past, and then he turned around and did whatever he needed to do to the men on that bed." "It doesn't look like a slaughterhouse," Miller whispered, standing by the door as if afraid to cross the threshold fully, his eyes darting around the room, looking for horrors that weren't immediately visible. "It looks like a hotel room, a cheap boarding house." "That's the point," Jay said, turning away from the window to face the bed, the emptiness of it screaming louder than any corpse could. "It's designed to be forgotten, to be ordinary. If you walked in without knowing, you'd see a lonely man's bedroom. You wouldn't see the grave. He moved to the wardrobe, a tall, dark structure that dominated one wall, its doors closed tight. Jay hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, the instinct to protect himself warring with the duty to uncover. He pulled the door open. Inside, suits hung in neat rows, shirts buttoned to the collar, ties knotted and suspended from the rail. Civil servant attire. Respectable. The clothes of a man who worked in an office, who took the bus to Whitehall, who paid his taxes and voted in local elections. There was nothing here to suggest a monster, no ritualistic robes, no trophies of bone or flesh. Just the mundane uniform of the British state, hanging in the dark, waiting to be worn again. Nothing, Miller said, leaning in to look, his relief palpable, a short exhalation that fogged the air between them. Just clothes. Look closer, Jay said, reaching past the suits to the back of the wardrobe, his fingers brushing against the rear panel. Check the lining, check the floor. He didn't keep them all in the bed. Sometimes he kept them here, wrapped up, waiting for the bath to be free. Miller recoiled, stepping back until his heels hit the doorframe, his face draining of what little color remained. You think there's, in the wardrobe? I think he had systems, Jay said, dropping his hand, leaving the suits undisturbed. Different methods for different times. When the drain blocked, he used the shed. When the shed was full, he used the fire. And when he was busy or tired or just waiting for the right moment, he kept them close, in the dark, with his Sunday best. A heavy thud came from downstairs, followed by the sharp clatter of metal on linoleum, echoing up the stairwell like a gunshot. Both men froze, heads turning towards the door, the silence of the room shattered by the intrusion of the living world. Search team, Miller said, his voice regaining some of its professional steel, though his hands still trembled slightly at his sides. They're bringing the kits up. They'll want to start with the bathroom first, sir. Check the plug hole. The smell is strongest in there. Jay nodded, taking one last look at the bed, the perfect corners, the single pillow. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to strip the sheets, to tear the room apart until nothing remained but bare plaster and floorboards, to destroy the sanctity of this place where such unspeakable acts had been performed with such calm precision. But he couldn't. This was evidence now. Every thread, every dust mote, every scratch on the floor was part of the story they would have to tell in court, to a judge, to a jury, to the families who waited in the cold outside. Let them in, Jay said, walking past Miller towards the corridor, the scent of the sweet decay following him like a shadow. Start with the bathroom, but tell them to save the wardrobe. I want a photographer in here first. Every inch of those suits needs to be recorded before we touch a single hanger. And the bed, Miller asked, holding the door open, his eyes asking the question he dared not speak aloud. Leave it, Jay said, stepping out into the hall, the air slightly fresher here, though still tainted by the underlying rot. Leave it exactly as it is. Let him see it when we bring him back. Let him see that we know. He walked towards the bathroom, the door still ajar, the white porcelain gleaming in the gloom, and felt the weight of the day settling onto his shoulders, a heavy coat that he knew he would never be able to take off. The water in the pipes gurgled softly, a sluggish, wet sound that spoke of blockages deep within the walls, of things that had been washed away but refused to disappear. Sir, Miller called again, his voice tighter now, urgent. The plumber is here. He says he found something in the U-bend under the sink, something he says isn't pipe scale. Jay stopped, his hand on the bathroom doorframe, the wood cold and damp under his palm. He closed his eyes for a second, bracing himself, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, would turn the suspicion into certainty, the theory into fact. Show me, he said, and pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, a physical weight that pressed against the sinuses, thick and cloying like overripe fruit left to rot in a sealed jar during the height of summer. It was not the sharp, chemical sting of bleach or the earthy damp of old pipes, but something sweeter, heavier, a scent that coated the back of the throat and refused to be swallowed down. Jay stepped over the threshold, his shoes sticking slightly to the linoleum, which was slick with a film of grease and water that had seeped from the sink. The bathroom was small, claustrophobic, the walls tiled in a pale, sickly green that seemed to absorb the light from the single bulb hanging overhead. casting long, wavering shadows that danced as the plumbers moved. Two men in blue overalls were crouched by the vanity unit, their backs hunched, shoulders tense beneath the coarse fabric of their uniforms. One held a torch, the beam cutting a narrow cone through the gloom to illuminate the space beneath the porcelain basin, while the other wielded a heavy wrench, the metal gleaming dully in the artificial light. Neither man looked up as Jay entered, their attention fixed entirely on the U-bend, a curved section of plastic pipe that had been loosened but not yet removed. "It's stuck, Gov," the man with the wrench muttered, his voice rough, edged with a frustration that bordered on fear. "Whatever it is, it's wedged tight, won't budge with the spanner." Jay moved closer, the floor cold even through the soles of his boots, and crouched beside them, ignoring the protest of his knees, the stiff joints complaining after hours of standing in the chill air of the house. He leaned in, the sweet odor intensifying, becoming almost tangible, a presence that filled the small room and crowded out the oxygen. "What does it feel like?" he asked, his voice low, steady, though his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of dread that he tried to ignore. The plumber hesitated, wiping his hands on a rag that was already stained with grime and something darker, something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Soft," he said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. "Not like hair or soap scum. It gives way a bit like meat, ripe meat." Miller stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light from the hall, his face pale, the color drained away as if pulled by a vacuum. He did not speak, did not move, simply watched as the plumber gripped the plastic pipe with both hands, his knuckles white with the effort, and gave a sharp, jerking twist. The pipe groaned, a wet, sucking sound echoing in the small space, and then, with a sudden, slick release, it came free. A slurry of dark water spilled out onto the floor, spreading rapidly across the tiles, carrying with it chunks of grayish matter that floated lazily on the surface before settling into the depressions of the linoleum. The smell intensified instantly, overwhelming, a wave of pure decay that made Jay's eyes water, his stomach lurching violently as he fought the urge to retch. He held his ground, forcing himself to look, to witness the evidence that had been hiding in the walls, flowing unseen beneath the feet of the neighbors who walked their dogs and took out their bins, unaware of the horror circulating in the sewers beneath their feet. "Christ," the second plumber whispered, scrambling back, his boots slipping on the wet floor, his face twisted in disgust. That can't be right." Jay reached out, his hand trembling slightly despite his efforts to control it, and picked up a fragment of the matter from the puddle. It was fibrous, pale, with a texture that was unmistakably organic, unmistakably human. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, the cold slime soaking into his skin, and felt a profound sense of sickness wash over him, a realization that settled in his bones like a deep, freezing cold. This was not a blockage, it was a graveyard. "Bag it," Jay said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, stripped of emotion, reduced to a mechanical command. "Everything, every piece, don't wash it down, don't touch it with bare hands again, seal it all." Miller stepped forward then, moving past the plumbers who were busy scrambling for plastic sacks, their movements hurried, panicked, as if trying to escape the room before the walls closed in on them. He crouched beside Jay, his gaze fixed on the fragment in Jay's hand, his expression a mixture of horror and a grim, professional resignation. "Is it?" he started, then stopped, unable to finish the question, the words dying in his throat before they could be spoken. "It's him," Jay said, dropping the fragment into an evidence bag that Miller held open with shaking hands. "Or one of them. There's no telling how many. The pipes. They've been carrying them away for years, washing them out into the main drain, piece by piece." He stood up, his legs feeling weak, unsteady, as if the floor beneath him had turned to quicksand. The bathroom seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in, the air growing thinner, harder to breathe. The sweet smell was everywhere now, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his skin, a perfume of death that he knew would never truly wash off. He looked at the sink, the innocent white porcelain, and felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, directed at the man who had sat in this room, washed his hands, and lived his life while flushing parts of human beings into the darkness. "The rest of the house," Jay said, turning to Miller, his eyes hard, devoid of any pity or hesitation. "We tear it apart, Floorboards, walls, the garden shed, everywhere. If the pipes are full, God knows what else we'll find buried in the soil. Miller nodded, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I'll get the team and the forensics unit. They'll need to start mapping the drainage system, trace where it all leads. Do it, Jay said, stepping over the puddle of foul water, careful not to slip, careful not to disturb the evidence scattered across the floor. And Miller, keep the press out. No one goes in or out without my say, not yet. He walked out of the bathroom, leaving the plumbers to their grim task, the sound of their retching following him down the hall. The house felt different now, alive with a malignant energy, the silence no longer empty but heavy with the presence of the dead. He moved towards the window, pushing aside the net curtain to look out at the street below, where the lights of the police cars flashed red and blue against the wet pavement, casting erratic patterns on the opposite houses. A figure stood on the corner, wrapped in a dark coat, watching the house with an intensity that suggested he knew more than he should. Jay squinted, trying to make out the face, but the distance and the flickering lights obscured the features, leaving only a shadow, a silhouette against the gloom. The figure raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the mist that clung to the streets of Muswell Hill. Jay let the curtain fall back into place, the lace settling softly against the glass. The game had changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a terrible, undeniable certainty. The quiet hill of bones had revealed its secret, and now the work truly began. He turned back towards the stairs, the smell of decay trailing behind him like a ghost, and prepared to face the night ahead, knowing that sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford. The water in the pipes gurgled again, a final, wet sigh from the depths, as if the house itself was breathing, exhaling the truths it had held for so long. The gurgling stopped. A wet final click echoed from the U-bend, like a throat clearing itself of phlegm before falling shut. Jay turned from the window, the lace curtain slipping from his fingers to settle back against the glass with a soft, dusty sigh. The room held its breath, waiting for the next command, but the air itself felt thick, resistant, as though the atmosphere had coagulated alongside the matter in the pipes. He needed to move. Standing still meant breathing it in, letting the scent of cooked meat and old soil seep into the pores of his face, marking him as one of the dead before the coroner had even signed a form. Miller, he said, the name cracking slightly in the dry air. The landlord, where is Thorne? Outside, sir, by the van. He's smoking, chain-smoking by the look of it. Miller wiped his hands on a handkerchief that had already seen too much use, the white cotton staining grey where he rubbed at his palms. He says he wants to know if the insurance will cover the disruption to the other tenants. Can you believe that? Insurance. Jay stepped over the puddle again, the sole of his shoe making a wet sucking sound as it lifted from the linoleum. The noise was obscene, an intimate reminder of the fluid dynamics of death that had been playing out beneath the floorboards while the rest of London slept. He walked past the plumbers, who were now kneeling in the sludge, their movements slow and deliberate, as if rushing might cause the fragments to dissolve entirely into the sewage. One of them, a younger man with a moustache damp with sweat, looked up as Jay passed, his eyes wide and glassy, fixed on the detective chief inspector with a plea for absolution that Jay had no power to grant. Leave the tools, Jay ordered, not breaking stride. We'll have SOCOS bring their own. Nothing leaves this room unless it's bagged and tagged. Understand? The plumber nodded, a jerky mechanical motion, and returned to scraping a pale, fibrous strand from the grout between the tiles. The sound of the scraper against the ceramic was high-pitched, grating, setting Jay's teeth on edge. He pushed open the bathroom door and stepped into the hallway, where the air was marginally clearer, though the sweet, cloying undertow still pulled at the back of his nose, a ghostly finger tracing the septum. The house was quiet, save for the distant murmur of voices from the garden and the heavy thud of boots on the stairs as the uniformed officers began to secure the perimeter. Thorne stood on the front step, sheltering under the small porch roof from the drifting mist that had settled over Muswell Hill. A cigarette burned between his fingers, the cherry glowing bright orange in the gloom, illuminating the deep lines of worry etched around his mouth. He wore a dressing gown over his suit trousers, the belt tied loosely, suggesting he had been dragged from bed without time for propriety. As Jay approached, Thorne flicked the ash onto the pavement, watching it scatter in the wind before looking up, his expression a mixture of defiance and terror. "Is it done?" Thorne asked, his voice raspy from smoke and tension. "Can I go back in? The tenants are asking. Mrs. Gable downstairs, she's hysterical. Says she heard the water running all night and thought it was just a leak." "It wasn't a leak, Mr. Thorne." Jay stopped a foot away, close enough to smell the tobacco and the underlying tang of fierce sweat radiating from the man. "And you aren't going back in? Not tonight. Maybe not for weeks." "Weeks?" Thorne's hand trembled, sending a shower of ash onto his own lapel. He brushed at it frantically, as if the grey dust were contaminated. "You can't be serious. It's a blocked pipe. You've seen it. The plumbers have cleared it. What more do you need?" "We need to find out where the rest of it went." Jay kept his voice low, flat, devoid of the anger bubbling beneath his ribs. "The blockage wasn't just in the U-bend, Thorne. It was in the main line. And it wasn't just grease or rags. You know that now, don't you?" Thorne looked away, his gaze fixing on the police car parked across the street, its blue light pulsing rhythmically against the wet brickwork of the opposite terrace. The light swept over his face, turning his skin a sickly shade of violet before plunging him back into shadow. He took a drag of his cigarette, inhaling deeply, holding the smoke in his lungs as if it could shield him from the words Jay was speaking. "I told the council," Thorne whispered, the smoke escaping in a thin, grey stream. "Last year, about the smell, said the drains were backing up, said it smelled like something rotting in the garden. They sent a man. He said it was the trees, roots in the pipes. Common in this area, he said." "And you believed him?" "What else could I do?" Thorne turned back, his eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate irritation. "It's an old house, detective. Things break, things smell. You don't call the police every time a toilet backs up. You call a plumber, you pay the bill, you move on." Jay stared at him, seeing not a villain, but a man constructed of small compromises, each one paving the way for the horror now spreading across his floorboards. The banality of it was suffocating. The sheer, mundane willingness to ignore the signs because they were inconvenient, because they cost money, because they disturbed the quiet rhythm of the street. It was a cancer of indifference, metastasizing in the dark until the pipes burst and the truth spilled out onto the line. "Who lives in the flat above?" Jay asked, shifting the focus, needing to ground himself in the immediate logistics of the cordon. "Nobody. It's been empty since Christmas. The last lad moved out, said he couldn't sleep with the noise. The gurgling, he called it, said the walls sounded like they were crying." Thorne laughed, a short, brittle sound that died quickly in the cold air. "I thought he was joking. Young people, always dramatic." Jay didn't smile. He looked past Thorne into the dark mouth of the hallway where the shadows seemed to stretch out towards them, hungry and waiting. The house was a vessel filled with secrets that had been flushed away, piece by piece, into the city's veins, and now the circulation had stopped. The heart of the place had clotted. "Get Mrs. Gable a cup of tea," Jay said, turning towards the gate. "Strong, with sugar, and tell her she can't go back inside until we say so. If she asks why, tell her it's a gas leak, a structural issue, anything but the truth." "And the others?" Thorne called after him, his voice rising in panic. "What do I tell the neighbors? They're gathering, looking at the lights." Jay paused at the gate, his hand resting on the cold iron latch. Across the street, the net curtains in the opposite houses were drawn tight, but he could feel the eyes behind them, watching, judging, cataloguing every movement. The community was waking up, sensing the disturbance in its order, the breach in the silent agreement to look away. "Tell them nothing," Jay said, pushing the gate open. The hinges squealed, a sharp, metallic cry that cut through the damp silence. "Let them watch. Let them wonder. By morning, they'll know. By morning, none of us will be able to pretend anymore." He stepped out onto the pavement, the cold dampness seeping through the soles of his shoes. The mist had thickened, swirling around his ankles, obscuring the ground beneath him. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a lonely, rising note that faded into the night, swallowed by the heavy, sleeping city. Jay buttoned his coat against the chill, feeling the weight of the evidence bag in his pocket, the slimy fragment pressing against his thigh like a second heartbeat. The night was young, and the work had only just begun. The drains would have to be traced, mile by mile, through the dark arteries of London until every piece was found, until every name was known. He walked towards his car, the gravel crunching under his feet, each step a promise to the dead that he would not look away, not now, not ever. The house behind him stood silent, but the pipes within it were still singing, a low, wet hymn of the lost. The Quiet Hill of Bones is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Dennis Nilsen, Muswell Hill, researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.